So, Pete, should we make a start?
Yep, let's do that.
Okie dokie. Good morning, everybody, and a warm welcome to this joint Principal Social Worker and Principal OT Networks lead meeting today. So glad to have you here with us. My name's Andrew Errington, and I'm Head of Practice Development, Safeguarding and Adults Principal Social Worker at Coventry City Council, and I am the co-chair of the West Midlands Principal Social Worker Network. So just opening up this conference today with my colleague Pete.
Good morning. I'm Pete Budge. I'm the clinical lead for occupational therapy in Solihull Borough Council, and I'm the outgoing chair for the Principal OT Network for ADASS.
Thank you. So a very warm welcome to everybody today. This event we had planned last year, but we did postpone it due to COVID. But we have returned this year on a kind of virtual kind of basis with a little bit more of a kind of condensed kind of session, just by virtue of the fact it kind of works for this kind of medium. But we're keeping a similar focus to the ones we've had in previous years around kind of strength-based practice. But really pleased to be joined today by OT colleagues and to do this event kind of jointly. We do work with OT colleagues on a day-to-day basis, so it's nice to kind of do this event together today. And I think as you said last night, Pete, it's a good opportunity for us to come together and a good opportunity for us to learn together as well at the same time. But just some little bits of kind of housekeeping. I will dispense with the usual where are the fire exits and where are the toilets, because hopefully you're familiar with your kind of surroundings. But the usual kind of MS Teams etiquette does apply. If you could kind of mute your kind of microphone, that would be great. It just cuts out all the background noise. And if you can turn off your video as well, it just allows us to see those people who are speaking. We do have a little kind of chat function though. Our plan is at the end of our guest speakers to have a little bit of a Q&A, a bit of a question and answer kind of session. So if you want to pose any questions you have for our speakers in the chat, those will be picked up by Karen and Joe Jackson, who will pose the questions to the speakers. Karen, I don't know if do you want to kind of say hello so people can see who you are, that you do exist in real life.
Hi everybody. I think it'll probably help as well because we've got obviously OTs and social workers, social care assessors and social work in general, as long as, you know, if you could potentially, if you pop in a question into the chat function, if you just put if you're an OT or a social worker, and then we can feed it back to the relevant person, that would be amazing. But I'm Karen Nixon, Principal Social Worker at Midlands Partnership NHS Trust. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Joe, are you there as well? Do you want to come and say hello so people know who you are?
Hi, I'm Joe. I'm an occupational therapist by background, and I'm the reablement team manager in Solihull, and will be assisting Karen working out your questions and hopefully collating something that's useful to put to our speakers at the end.
Lovely. Thank you both very much. Just a couple of other things just to say that MS Teams automatically records attendee kind of details. This just helps us to identify people who have joined who we weren't kind of expecting and kind of allows us to forward any information after the event. Please be assured, we're not going to share your kind of data or kind of sell your data to a third party. We can be trusted. We are professionals. We will only kind of use it to kind of circulate kind of information post this event, such as the PowerPoint or the recording. We are going to have a break today, which is about kind of 11 o'clock. So if you want, you can simply just continue switching off your video and audio or leave and kind of rejoin. It's entirely up to you. Next slide, please, Shelley. So in terms of welcomes and introductions, I've said who I am and Pete said who he is. A couple of other colleagues to introduce you to, who you'll be hearing from towards the end of the session. The first one, I think, is Sienna. Sienna, do you want to come and say hello to everybody?
Morning, everybody. It's great to be here and see so many people join us. I am Sienna Lassiter and I am the Principal Social Worker in Adult Social Care, Walsall Council. Great. Good to see you.
Morning, Sienna. And Andrea, would you like to come and say hello?
Morning, everybody. It's really good to see so many people. My name is Andrea Grano and I'm the Principal Occupational Therapist at Walsall Council. Have a great time this morning, and we look forward to all of the speakers and all of your contribution.
Many thanks. Next slide. I think, Pete, you're going to take us through this one. Is that correct?
Yeah, by all means, that's great. Shelley, if you could let us have the agenda, we can go through that, can't we? So, yeah, great to see everybody. As Andrew and everybody else has said, that it's really nice to be able to do this together, isn't it, with our social work colleagues and OTs as a group, because as Andrew says, we all work with each other so much. We're really lucky with the speakers that we've got this morning. We're really proud to have Karen join us from the Royal College of Occupational Therapists. She'll be our first speaker, and then we're going to also hear from Fran Ledra from the Chief Social Worker Office at the Department of Health and Social Care. So no doubt lots to look forward to there. We will be doing a little Q&A afterwards, so remember to submit your questions on the chat, which will be collated and put to our speakers. We will have a short break just for comfort, and then we'll return to hear from our third speaker, who will be Professor Robin Miller from Birmingham University. Lots to talk about strengths-based practice with Professor Miller, and again a short Q&A with him following on too, before closing remarks with Sienna and Andrea. I'm really keen to say, if you can give us some survey evaluation at the end, that's really key for us, because it's great to be able to think about these events and see if we can improve them or tweak them or make them more useful. So that would be really valuable if everybody's happy to do that. I'm going to hand back to Andrew because the clock's ticking and we can move on. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Pete. Just go back one slide if that's okay, Shelley. We do have a hashtag for today, so if anybody is Twitter inclined, there is a hashtag which you can use to kind of share your kind of thoughts and kind of reflections in terms of this event. At the minute, it mostly involves me and Pete having a conversation with each other, so feel free, everybody, to kind of join in if you do use Twitter. Danielle has joined. Hello, Danielle, and welcome. Anybody join? No worries. Anybody joining, if you could please turn off your video and mic, that would be lovely. Next slide, please, Shelley. So just a couple of slides, I think, from me, and a couple of slides from kind of Pete, just to kind of talk a little bit about our respective kind of networks. So most areas now will have a PSW for adults and a PSW for children's, and some areas have a PSW who cover both adults and children's, really. But those are supported by regional networks, so regional networks such as the West Midlands, but obviously networks into the Northeast and the Northwest and the Southwest. And there is a kind of national network where those regional networks come together on a regular basis, including an event a year where children's and adults do come together nationally. Just to say that the principal social worker role is mentioned in the Care Act in statutory guidance, and it says local authorities should make arrangements to have a qualified and registered social work professional lead. Pete will probably mention how there's a bit of momentum behind having principal OTs as well, so to kind of make sure that role is equally kind of recognised. But in the West Midlands, we have a network which I co-chair with Sienna, very kind of well established, very well attended. Last year, we increased the frequency of those meetings, and we've met virtually since last year, which has increased our kind of attendance and saved on that kind of travel across the kind of West Midlands, kind of coming into Birmingham. So a likelihood that we will continue with that kind of mode of delivery going forward. Next slide, please. So as a network, we do have a plan. We do have a work plan, which includes some of the activities we do as a network. Certainly things around kind of developing practice and shaping practice and workforce development activities. But as an example, a couple of examples, we do practice reviews. We have done these for quite a few years now. I think we've done about 26 in total. And they include, or they involve a couple of PSWs going to visit another local authority to kind of look at practice, to kind of review that practice from a strength-based practice point of view, talking to the PSW, talking to director, talking to kind of staff and managers as well, and coming up to identify things which could improve or to recognise good practice. And a really nice way of kind of having some kind of peer support and a good opportunity to kind of take away things that you like, you know, so we could identify things which one local authority is doing well, and we may borrow that and kind of take that home, as it were. We're also working with research in practice around a relaunch of the post-qualifying standards for social work practice supervisors. These were published in 2018, and effectively our standards regarding social workers who supervise social workers. And we're quite keen on these standards because at their heart they talk about professional supervision, they talk about critically reflective kind of supervision. So we are keen to kind of get behind these and support these, really, as supervision is clearly a practice condition which we want to support. So that's just a little bit about the PSW network, and I'm going to hand over to Pete to talk about the OT Leads network.
Wonderful, thank you, Andrew. So yeah, we've got a similar story, but obviously slightly different. I think the first thing to kick off with is in the last couple of years, particularly 2-3 years, we've really been pushing the message of occupational therapy within local authority, within social care, and we really feel we're beginning to gain some traction and gain some recognition of the value of OT, which I know the Royal College has been really supportive with as well and pushing that. So it's a positive message. And really embracing the contribution that occupational therapy makes towards, Andrew mentioned the wellbeing ethos of the Care Act, but focusing on strengths-based practice, which lots of OTs see as being integral to practice and something that we do really, really well, but perhaps don't talk about enough. So we're seeing people focusing on supporting independence as much as possible in their own homes, our role in keeping carers and the cared for alike, but safe and able to engage with their environment, but also Joe's role in rehabilitating people post-discharge and getting them back to optimum functional outcome. The other thing, obviously, the elephant in the room is post-pandemic. The pandemic's been going on, lots and lots of effects being felt across services and with individuals, obviously, but even more so now, the time for occupational therapy to shine. I mentioned reablement, particularly there, where it's more important than ever after COVID to support those who've lost ability through ill health to achieve as much as they can. And I think that's being felt across local authorities now, with the demand for OT rising particularly so. And we're seeing that reflected in things like recruitment challenges and rising demand. The principal occupational therapist role, somebody just asked a question about that, I see. So it's a mixed picture. Really helpful that we've got Royal College support behind the need to have a principal occupational therapist, and there are lots of authorities that do have them. It's a mixed picture across the West Midlands. We do have a list now, which I believe is going to be sent out with a pack afterwards as to how we stand with that. But really, it's a key time for occupational therapy leaders to take the message of OT further and to develop and support practice. So, for example, adapting to new COVID practices, we've done remote assessing, we've been guiding around when visits are needed, developing guidance, how they should be undertaking, and looking at risks and risk assessments, but also looking to the strategic outlook and the future challenges and needs, and including strengths-based is very much within this. So it's a role that's needed, recognised in some places, not in others, but really, really helpful to be pushing that message, and our group is part of that. And just the bottom line really folds in with that. It's about recognising that need for leadership right at the moment, and this is the time to shine. Shelley, could we have the next slide, please? So about our group, about our network, we are a really active group. We've progressed a lot recently in the last 2-3 years. We're very active, we're well attended, and it's a real chance for us lead and principal occupational therapists to support each other around practice and also around service challenges too. There has been a comment made as well, which is very nice to hear, very flattering, that we might be one of the leading ADASS OT networks in the country, and it's something we really want to develop and take forward. And I know Andrea and her colleague Emma, who are taking over from the chair position, will be working on that very much so in the coming couple of years. So we are a strong network, and similar to the PSW network, we have a plan. I've popped a copy on there, and you can access it through the link. Hello, Danielle. she's exiting the meeting. But yes, what I would say is it's very much about advocating and demonstrating the benefits of the outcomes associated with occupational therapy. So do take time to have a look at the work we've been doing. And I'll just finish before handing over to our first speaker, just to say that this really is very much a time for occupational therapists to seize. This is a time to talk about the work that we do, to talk about our profession, to talk about the outcomes that we achieve with residents, and to have a real close partnership with colleagues, which is why this event in itself is really, really refreshing and good to see that we can work with our colleagues in social work, but also we work with many more partners in housing, health, and so on. So this is a great thing to do, and really pleased to see so many occupational therapists and colleagues attending today. Shelley, if I could have the next slide, that'd be great. So without further ado, and look at that, bang on time, I'm going to hand over to Karin, who's kindly joined us from the Royal College, who is going to talk us through occupational therapy and strengths-based practice. So, Karin, can I hand over to you, please?
Thanks, Pete. There's always that moment of have I unmuted myself. Morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to come and speak today. I'm just going to spend a little bit of time thinking about the synergy between a strengths-based approach and reflect on what needs to happen for it to be widely adopted, what happens within organisations which either supports or hinders the adoption of this type of approach. And then just talk a little bit about how our COT is taking a strengths-based approach in our work, in particular around highlighting the role of occupational therapy in social care. So there is a natural synergy with occupational therapy. I think a strengths-based approach sort of recognises and values the capacity, the skills, the connections, the assets that are already there, and the potential of the person, their family, friends, and the communities that they belong within. It requires a personalised approach. You have to work in collaboration. And it also is reflected already in existing occupational therapy models. MOHO instantly sprung to mind for me, where we look at where there are strengths and how do we use those strengths to address needs and challenges. And the approach helps people develop skills they already have or need to develop, which is very much around the focus for reablement. So I think it is a, I think most occupational therapists will think about a strength-based approach and go, yeah, that's what we do already. But there are many factors impact on the successful adoption of any new approach. And I think it's useful to think about the 3 levels of organisational culture. Now, this is a model that was originally developed within health. I think it really does apply within social care. And we used this organisational culture model when we did some work looking at care homes and the delivery of activity and supporting people to be more active within care homes. So the first one is the visible manifestations. So that includes the distribution of services and roles between organisations, such as the divides between health and social care. And we see this in particular around the move to discharge to assess. We see that there is a lack of understanding and trust sometimes with occupational therapists based in hospitals and acute, particularly around managing risk when somebody is discharged into the community. Risk can be very much sort of managed around protecting the service and the staff, rather than thinking about embracing that risk to enable the individual to have more choice and control. It also includes the established pathways and processes through care, the demarcation between staff groups and the activities performed. And we all know within teams that there can be tussles that challenge or reinforce these. It describes the staffing practice and reporting arrangements, and the visible manifestations just also capture the established ways, both formal and informal, of managing risk and the accepted ways of responding to staff and public concerns. The second level of organisational culture is our shared ways of thinking. So within teams, think the shared values and beliefs that we use to justify and sustain the visible manifestations above and their associated behaviours. These are the shared rationales that we have, which can either sort of maintain an existing culture or be used to put forward new ways of doing things. And then the deeper shared assumptions. They're largely unconscious and unexamined. The underpinnings of day-to-day practice are ideas about appropriate professional roles and delineations, and our expectation and assumptions about people and carers' knowledge and dispositions. So how do we challenge and reflect on those 3 different levels as an organisation? So as a service, we need to be thinking, what are our visible manifestations supporting or hindering a strengths-based approach? What needs to change? What needs to be amplified? Who needs to be signed up and involved in making changes? What's our plan of action, including goals and measures? And is an integrated approach being adopted Are we talking to other sectors, our health colleagues, colleagues in private and charity sector? And then we need to repeat that at a team level and also at an individual level. Next slide, thanks. So we mustn't underestimate the skills it takes successfully to adopt this approach. There may be natural synergy, it may be, yes, we get it, but not everyone will share our assumptions and beliefs, nor have the confidence or understanding and skills to readily adopt a strengths-based approach. And then also people coming into our services are coming in crisis, they're coming in need. We need to help them to understand and recognise what they have in place already, and then where the service can be focused. At our COT, I mean, Pete sort of mentioned some of the work that we're doing, but our strength is in our membership. And so we're doing some ongoing scoping of best practice, particularly over the pandemic. We've been collecting and highlighting innovation, best practice, adoption of digital. You'll have seen those, our members will have seen that in various articles within OT News. We use those in our ongoing conversations at a national level, particularly as we are now moving into this conversation around recovery. How do we get the country back on its feet again? Supporting and growing leadership, the network of principals, we've delivered skills for care workshops, and we're developing a document highlighting the role and benefits of principal occupational therapy. We're growing our RCOT representatives database. So what we're trying to do is use volunteers with expertise to represent the profession on national work streams, and also to respond to media requests, and also to sense checks. So we set up virtual task and finish groups to support us in pieces of work. And we work with partners to input into thinking, policy and potential legislation at a national level. At the moment, we're involved in roundtable talks around future of social care. And we have a funded project from NHSX, which is involving Ipsos Mori, Skills for Care, around a review of digital technology and skills in adult social care. And then, of course, we've got resources in place, which I haven't highlighted here, but I think particularly relevant for your meeting today is our Embracing Risk Enabling Choice document. Again, available for members to support them, to give them confidence in collaborating and working with people and enabling them to really live the life that they want to lead. Thank you. I hope that's on time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Really pleased to have you joining us today, Karen. And thank you very much for your kind of reflections on strength-based practice and how as a college you're kind of supporting strength-based practice. Usually if we were in a kind of room, imagine we're in Birmingham, because that's usually where we would be, and we'd be in this kind of big room. And at this point, we'd usually kind of give some applause to kind of speakers. But unfortunately, we can't do that in this way, but we can do it kind of virtually. So yes, there we go. Yep. People have got the memo. People have got the applause memo. There you go.
Thank you, lovely. Thank you.
There you go. If you're okay, to sort of stay around a little bit, we're going to have another speaker, and then we're going to get into some Q&A. So just a plea to those who are in attendance today, there is the opportunity to kind of use the chat to ask questions. We're up to 167 people. 167 people have joined us today, and we might work on the basis of a couple of questions for Karen, a couple of questions for Fran, but we'll see how that kind of goes, kind of time-wise. But if it's okay, if we can move on to the next slide, Shelley, if that's okay. It's a great pleasure, to be able to welcome Fran, Ledra, our Chief Social Worker for Adults from the Department of Health and kind of Social Care, to our event today. Fran, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear. I was just going to say to people, you used to be a duo, didn't you, Fran? You used to be a duo. How's things since Mark has gone back to his previous role?
So I job shared with Mark up until the 1st of April, and then I've had the whole of April and the beginning of May doing this on role on my own. And then Lynn Romeo is back, and she's currently doing 2 days a week. And as it stands at the moment, I'm still there at least till July. So I've got a new job share, which is, of course, wonderful Lynn Romeo, who's now back from her year and a half in Australia. So yeah, it's all been changed as it has been for all of us, I suppose.
So I'll hand over to you, Fran, if that's okay.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Andrew, for inviting me. I jumped at the opportunity to be here because I've spent the last year working really closely with Susan Rastrick at our Deputy Chief Allied Health Professional at the NHS to try and better work with the occupational therapy world so that we can join up better at a national level as well as a local level. And I do think the West Midlands is doing some really wonderful work in this space, kind of setting an example of how this can be done across other regions as well. And I worked closely also, and some of you will know Caroline Haig, who was the clinical fellow for the last year, to try again to make some of those kind of more national joined up links between social work and occupational therapy. So I'm a real champion of the fact we can't do our work as social workers without occupational therapists. I don't think you can be occupational therapists without social workers either, the same as we can't work, health professionals can't work alongside, do their work effectively without working alongside social work. So it's really important that we all join up. So thank you so much for inviting me today. So one of the things I'm going to do is I am going to just do a few slides about the national update from the CSW office, and also some of the challenges that we've faced the last year. And then my last couple of slides are going to be on where I see strengths-based and place-based social work and support going. So in terms of the Chief Social Work Office, it's been pretty much, I started the role in October 2019, which seems like so long ago now. And of course, very, very quickly within the first few months, we had a new pandemic, and all of us had to massively adapt to a whole new world. And pretty much my head has just been in COVID response, and now it's in COVID recovery. And in between time, you're trying to get on with some of your core business. And I know that that's exactly what it would have been like for all of you. Your day-to-day work hadn't suddenly just turned itself on its head. And we all had to kind of just really adapt quickly to a whole changing, not just a changing region or a changing country, a changing world. So the COVID response and the COVID recovery has taken up a huge amount of our time in DHSC, as I know it has you, and we've kept regularly in touch with the Principal Social Work Network, and we've been inviting occupational therapists to that as well. And I did do a few events for occupational therapy as well, just to try and keep that kind of live link between what was going on at the Department of Health and Social Care, as well as what was going on locally. The Principal Social Work Network connection has continued throughout and has really, really strengthened. And we know we've put a lot of additional burden on principal social workers throughout the country to lead, like, for example, in the Winter Plan and in other big key policy documents where we specifically mention principal social workers playing such a key role in making sure that that kind of work at a local level was joined up and responding very well to the pandemic. There's been a plethora of wellbeing guidance for staff with the new Care app as well, and I understand the Care app isn't going to continue, sadly, because I think it only ended up getting about 40,000 subscriptions. So for those people that have been using it, like me, sadly I don't know whether it's going to continue or not. But throughout that period of time, there's a huge amount of wellbeing guidance out there for staff. If you're struggling in any way at all, there is so much help out there, and I know there will be locally for you as well. But if you need to kind of like reach out and get support, there's a lot there. So in between that time, we have been developing some of our core annual report deliverables. So the transitional safeguarding briefing, which is called Bridging the Gap, is just about to be signed off and published, and I'm so excited about it. And this is a particular piece of work very close to my heart, which is around the sort of sexual exploitation and criminal exploitation of young people post 18. And as the Chief Social Work Office, we have been writing a briefing on this with all of our partners, and that's just about to be published. And then in the summer, we will be doing a broader safeguarding briefing with the intention of making practice across the country a bit more consistent around safeguarding. Hopefully some of you would have noticed that we published Music for Dementia, ensuring music was in everybody's care plans. Again, we're completely aware that everybody's has been COVID kind of, busy doing the work with the pandemic, so that something like this might be at the moment put to one side, but please remember it's there. And throughout, we were hearing stories throughout the pandemic, especially with people not seeing their loved ones in care homes, that actually music played a really, really important part in their well-being. Seems like a really simple thing, but massively important for us as professionals to understand the way music touches people's lives. There was a research study produced by, which we commissioned from Dr. Jeremy Dixon at Bath University, which was involving people with dementia in safeguarding research. And we've just recently, it's not published yet, but it very soon will be. We asked Sky to do a discharge to assess study for us, which will soon be published. It's really interesting. It's probably what you all know, that actually, whilst we like the fact that it speeded things up, the new discharge to assess during the pandemic, actually the pathway for people, looking at people holistically in their whole journey, wasn't so effective. And some outcomes for people weren't as good, even though we tried really hard to do that. And where it works well is where locally the principal social workers, principal occupational therapists and our health workers work really, really closely together to ensure that somebody's discharged still with a really good care plan. We have now piloting a workforce equality standard, race equality standard, which is now in 18 local authorities, and that is continuing. And of course, we've continued throughout the whole of the pandemic to really base our whole kind of way that we work on strength-based social work and support. We have championed the workforce and promoted good practice throughout. And of course, one very key bit of our agenda at the moment is the social care reform. And there's a huge amount of work going on, whole teams working on social care reform at the moment. So if you get an opportunity to be involved, then please do so. Anti-racist practice, I mean, gosh, it was another incredible year in terms of, what we saw with the George Floyd murder, and some of that outpouring of emotion. And we are seeing in social work, and I'm guessing it would be very much similar in occupational therapy as well, this kind of resurgence of those core values that we hold around anti-racist practice. And of course, we published the ethical framework, which I'm hoping people are still using, and we want to further develop the ethical framework so that it continues in practice and doesn't just become something that was in the pandemic. Next slide, please. So COVID continues to challenge us, and these are what we are seeing nationally as some of those very, very key issues. So face-to-face contact has been gradually increasing over time. Social workers throughout have been visiting. I certainly know social workers where I work have been visiting throughout. This kind of myth that we're all sitting at home on our computers is a myth. Social workers have been out on the front line throughout, and face-to-face contact is increasing, especially as we do more community-based social work again. Technology, what we're doing now, how's that going to look in the future? Are we all going to continue to work differently? I guess we will be. I'm sure there won't be so much travelling around our counties going to various different meetings. Now we've got this wonderful technology to do it. But then again, we kind of always think we want it to complement our work and not take over our work. So it's a really tricky one. People will be gradually using the normal touch points, and this may bring with it new safeguarding referrals and assessment referrals. Social work voice in local decision making. I've already talked about the discharge to assess. It is really important as professionals that you are there, your voice is loud and clear in that local decision making, health colleagues. A lot of people are still in fear and feeling isolated. And one of the things you'll know, because you're out there in touch with your people in your communities, is that whilst some people will be getting back to some sort of normality, a lot of people are still very scared and feel very isolated. And so we need to be very, 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 very mindful of that. There's been a lot of talk in the last year around learning disabilities and closed cultures. So we're already concerned about the whole closed cultures agenda, which is, people in closed environments, residential or hospital settings with learning disabilities who need to have social workers visiting to check that they're doing okay and that they're getting the care and support that they need. And of course, during COVID, that those institutions were even more closed down. So there's a lot of work going on around learning disabilities and closed cultures. This one's an interesting one. When does infection protection and prevention and control, when does it become safeguarding? So when does your poor IPC practices become safeguarding? Who would have thought, just even 2 years ago, that as social workers we'd be thinking about infection protection and prevention and control? It's a whole new world for us. PPE, making sure that we're safe, is a whole new world, and there are a lot of dilemmas, a lot of national debates about when does something tip over that's so poor that it tips over into being you're putting somebody at risk and it becomes safeguarding. Vaccinations, there is a consultation regarding the requirement for carers to become vaccinated. That is still out for consultation at the moment. I'm hoping that you would have responded to that as a region. Very, very important that we have a say in that. This stuff is really, really difficult. There's a huge amount of bereavement and loss, and somehow, regardless of the support we're doing locally, somehow there's something about the fact we're going to almost, as the hypothesis is that as we kind of come out of this, it's actually not going to get better in terms of bereavement and loss. It's actually going to get worse, because that's going to suddenly hit people, that kind of, in reflection, that kind of awful time that we've had. Continually testing. I mean, I know with my social workers at Thurrock where I work, testing is really demanding on service. The testing to go anywhere, the testing to go in and see people, you must be feeling it yourselves, constantly being tested. That's still a massive demand for us. Constantly balancing those human rights with COVID risks has been a real, art of the social work world, and I'm sure of the occupational therapy world as well, having to kind of advise on how we balance those risks. And of course, there's been lots and lots of different ethical dilemmas that have come with that. Next slide, please. And the workforce challenges are changing. So still, we have staff who have to self-isolate, and still there are schools where there's a case and the child's sent home. And, I know it's changing now, but we've got this sort of thing lurking in the background, haven't we, about new variants. It hasn't gone away yet. So the way we're working has really had to change. Our homes have become our offices. That in itself puts pressure. That puts pressure on families. That puts pressure on yourself. We spend a huge amount of time looking at screens, don't we, now? So we've got to kind of think about how we gradually get away from that and get back to some sort of normality. I've already talked about PPC and IPC, talked about bereavement and loss. And then there's the post-emergency fatigue trauma challenges. I was having a conversation with the British Association of Social Work, PSWOT, just a couple of weeks ago about how we could look at some sort of a conference where we can bring together some, real experts in the field of post-emergencies and post pandemics, and talk about how we get through it together. Upholding our values and principles, the financial challenges, keeping up the morale of ourselves and others and staff. This is really demanding times, and we know there's still a high number of carer vacancies out there and a huge amount of demands on them. And of course, we know that there's social work students that, and of course our newly qualified students as well, and our newly qualified OTs. That whole challenge of getting people, in an environment which has been very much more online than it has been in the offices. Next slide. So we've been in a really privileged position to be working, throughout with people with lived experience, and these are the feedback that they give as to what really they've learned themselves, or what we can learn as well from what from this pandemic. So a real key message was to keep in contact with people when you are prioritising with everyone that you support. So this idea that, everybody on I call it a caseload, but everybody that you are working with, how often do you just touch base, check in that they're okay? And actually, how much do we get very involved in those people that are taking up a huge amount of our time? But what was really important during this period was when somebody, a social worker or their occupational therapist or a nurse, just picked up the phone and just said to somebody, how are you doing? Even though they weren't themselves showing that they were in any need of support at that period of time. So staying in touch was hugely important. There was a BBC survey came out that said that 60% of disabled people felt that their support had been reduced. And whilst we might look at our sort of Care Act assessments, we might say, well, actually, how could that have been? That is how people felt. 60%. It's a really high and damning number, really, to sort of people feeling that somehow their support had been reduced. It's just to be really mindful of how vulnerable and fragile people are feeling during this period of time. The outcomes from people through the discharge to assess model have not always been positive. Just to remember, it might have been quick, it might have been great in terms of like kind of breaking down bureaucracy, but we must still make sure that social work voice, that professional occupational therapy voice is there right from the beginning, so that people do have the potential to be re-abled, rather than just maybe going home and then getting into crisis again, going back into hospital, or going into a residential setting and actually not coming out, and actually they would have had the potential before to do so. Really big, loud and clear message from people with lived experience. Allow us to self-direct our support, something that we all probably feel we do, but actually we still have a long way to go to really handing over the trust to people and saying, look, here's your direct payment, or here's your money, you do it yourself, or here's your personal budget, just do what's right for you. And during COVID, there were some really positive stories that because we didn't have the resource to be going out and checking, people were getting on with it and actually get on with it really well. People really liked the fact that social work and occupational therapy and other caring professions were the voice of human rights and social justice throughout the pandemic. We were the people questioning about the visiting. We were the people questioning how we sort of walk alongside people and really protect their human rights. Always uphold our value, be strong alongside our health partners, and keep checking in on colleagues too. And it's that ask twice thing. So check in on your colleagues and say, how are you doing? And when they say you're okay, ask again. How are you doing? It's that constant check-in. So planning for the future in terms of post-COVID, there's going to be an awful lot of reflection time, taking time for self and work reflections. And we need to sit and have some time together as organisations, as teams, just to look at what went well and what didn't go so well. We all have to heal a bit from this, physically and emotionally. And I think about this in terms of reforming. So, thinking about that old kind of like the teams model, how do you get together as a team, and the storming, and, this, to me, it's like we've got to reform again together as teams. We've probably been the closest we've ever been in some ways, and yet we've been also the most distant. Togetherness, it sounds like a really woolly, washy word, but it's incredibly important that we all come together as professionals to really kind of come out of this. It might be painful at times, but actually we're going to come out of this and it's going to be more positive in the future. And we need to re-energise our whole commitment to strength-based practice. So now I want to just talk about, this to me is a really simple illustration of what strength-based practice just looks like. It's a really simple way of looking at it. So if you look at this picture now, and what do you see? And you think in your mind what you see. So the next clip, please. So you may see somebody with depression and mental illness, and that is exactly what Alan has. So Alan suffers from depression, suffers from bipolar. And the next bit, please. Loneliness, isolation, and fear is also, a really common feature of Alan. He has an alcohol addiction. He has suicidal and self-harm. And, how many times do you hear this? It's hard to engage in support. Okay, so I'm just going to hold it there for a minute. This is what we call looking at somebody from a deficit. So what we're looking at there, if you look at that page, imagine what it's like being Alan. If we're talking about his constant depression, his mental illness, his alcohol addiction, suicide, self-harm, loneliness, isolation, fear, hard to engage support. You could link Alan to all the therapies in the world. Alan is not going to be able to be in a position to respond to them. And somebody like Alan, this is a true story of somebody we worked with. Alan would be often found just in the street because his alcohol addiction and slumped in I remember one morning he was slumped in the post office, outside the post office. They didn't phone an ambulance, they phoned the police because he was making a mess, because he was in the kind of porch area of the post office. Everybody familiar with Alan, everybody familiar with who he was in the local community, and everybody feeling like we've tried absolutely everything, and Alan is just, he's Alan. And people stop seeing a human being and just see somebody that they've tried to fix and just can't. Then we start looking at a strength-based approach, and what do we see in Alan? So the next clip, please. Oh, sorry, that's another one. That's eviction and rent arrears. So what we learn about Alan is that he's actually a father of 2 daughters. He was a carpenter by trade. When you get to know Alan, this is a long journey. I'm not saying this stuff happens overnight, but if you ask Alan different questions and not about all his deficits, what you realise about Alan is one of the things he really wants to do with his life is to help others. And he wants to meet new people and build friendships. And you find out something like he plays guitar and he writes songs. Now, this is a really simple way of looking at it, but you could probably look at this with most of the people you're working with and think, how do we look at somebody now? So the old, I don't know whether you still have a resource, or any of you have the old resource allocation models with the tick boxes. They are so deficit based. We never ever adopted them where I worked, despite pressure to do so. But, you cannot go to somebody and support them in their life if you're just tick boxing a load of things that are wrong with them and how you're going to do to support them. And we've got to stop trying to fix people. And what strength-based work does is it talks about what the human being is in this whole situation and what their strengths are. Next slide, please. So for me, the building blocks for strengths-based policies in any way where you work is that you have to ask the question, what does a good life look like for you, rather than focus on somebody's needs, conditions and deficits. And don't build policies that try and fix people. People don't want to be fixed, they want to be supported. We talk about the term walking alongside people in their communities, enabling, promoting independence, and policies that hear the voice of lived experience always. Always focus on what's strong and not what's wrong. I know it's become a bit of a cliche now, but it's so true. Always look at what people can do for themselves, and always build your policies that promote independence. They're creative and they're very person-centered. And co-production, you should produce everything as much as you possibly can with those people in the sector and those people with lived experience. And then always remember the social model, the language you're using, you're promoting independence, you're taking risks, and policies that articulate the social model are really important for that balancing. And then finally, you can put up all the bits of the jigsaw here rather than do them one by one. So this, for me, is the whole system change that's needed in a strength-based, place-based kind of world. And one of the things I'm promoting in the Department of Health and Social Care in terms of reform. So it starts with understanding the experience of the whole system and change and interdependencies of health and social care. It starts also often with risk management and safeguarding. Making sure your workforce has the right skills and the right values. Understand the place in which you work. Even parts of the West Midlands will work differently within one region, and communities can, build. It's almost like neighbourhoods. You can have a community, but you can also have neighbourhoods within that community. So when we kind of say community, it's a bit of a nebulous thing. And what do we mean by it? And I kind of like the term neighbourhoods, but it's that idea that every single bit of the West Midlands may have a slightly different tweak depending on the neighbourhood that you're in. So understand the experience and people and environments within that neighbourhood. We have to work within budgets, and we have to be much better at creative resource sharing with our health partners and with other partners. Performance management is really important, but we say you've got to have meaningful collection of data, and we're saying this all the time, that actually we collect a lot of data that doesn't actually tell us a huge amount, and we need to do it in the right and most focused way. Strength-based, asset-based approaches and co-production, absolutely key. strong partnerships with our health, education, community sector, third sector and citizens is absolutely essential. And then we audit and evaluate and constantly learn, an assurance process that is way more connected with lived experience than it is just the way we do things and assuring ourselves. And we tend to do assurance by constantly assuring ourselves and our own departments without actually outwardly looking and getting people to come in and assure us from our neighbourhoods and communities. And we feel that's the kind of the key building blocks for reform. Thank you very much. I realise I've really spoken at you a huge amount there, and there's a lot of information in those slides, but I'm really happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Fran. Thank you so much for joining us today, and some fantastic kind of reflections really on, you know, the continuing kind of challenges of COVID-19. It just hasn't gone away. Do you know what I mean? And there's a massive kind of legacy associated with that, and certainly if we think about the kind of the ways of working, what those look like going forward, I need to keep talking about that and keep kind of reflecting on that, and in terms of new models of working. I love the kind of Alan slide. I think somebody asked in the chat, what happened to Alan? What happened to Alan? Just being able to sort of...
So Alan is doing really, really well, and Alan isn't drinking anymore, and Alan is working. He does carpentry for older people in their homes, where he's become a real asset to the community. Yeah, so Alan is actually doing extremely well.
Thanks. Lovely, that's great. Yeah, and I love the kind of the strength-based practice stuff and the kind of the whole system approach in terms of that. Yeah, it's about a practice, it's about workforce, but it's about kind of communities and partnerships, and I think that might kind of play into kind of Robin's kind of discussions after the break. But usually, as I said, the last time, Karen, the opportunity to kind of give applause, I've seen some of those kind of applause happening, but an opportunity to say thanks very much to you, Fran, for kind of joining us today in a fantastic sort of presentation. We know lots of them. Oh, that sounds lovely.
Thank you.
We've got a bit of a Q&A session now, so an opportunity for some questions. Thankfully, I haven't been keeping an eye on the chat because it's just been going on and on. So we have a couple of people who've been looking after the chat. So we've got kind of Joe and Karen. I don't know if Joe and Karen, if you want to turn your kind of cameras on, if we can kind of see you, because I think the plan was that we might start with some questions from Joe to Karen from any occupational therapy colleagues, and then we might take a couple of questions that Karen might have identified in the chat for Fran. So are you there, Joe and Karen?
I am here. I think if you actually want to see us, you have to sharing the screen, but then you'll probably see everybody. So that will probably get a bit crazy.
Well, what I'll do, I'll turn my camera off and allow you to ask your kind of questions to Karen, if that's okay. Yeah.
Okay, Karen, I have to say, people were fast and furious, I found, with the questions, and you actually responded to quite a few as we were going along. So perhaps I could take you back to some of those ones that you were addressing in the chat for those people who weren't following the chat. There was quite a strong focus on the risk management and the issues around embracing risk and enabling choice. There are also some questions around the D2A and links with OT and dementia and mental health, and the APH lead in MPFP. If you'd like to perhaps try and give us a bit more. And there was also a question about us OT adapting to the home first and early intervention. I don't know if that's a wide term, or I know we're using it in Solihull and Birmingham, we're using it, but hopefully other people are as well, around those kind of ideas. Is that enough for you to go on, or do you?
That's more than enough.
That's okay.
that's plenty. I think we actually held a virtual event around sort of the discharge to assess and the home first, which was very well attended and actually oversubscribed. So it just shows what a touch point this is. And I think that the model is great in theory, but we come back to the reason why I touched on looking at visible manifestations of culture. Those three different levels of culture is because what we do have is quite a clash of culture and a lack of trust between the different services, and I think that makes it a challenge, and different priorities. So I think where we have seen home first, discharge to assess, that model work effectively is where there are really strong links between community rehab teams, social care, particularly reablement teams, and the therapy teams based in A&E, and covering that that initial 24-hour, 48-hour admission into hospital. So I think it is important to try and network and to reach out. And I think, you know, going to Fran's point about everybody, their resilience is low, everybody's exhausted, everybody's worn out. Where there are differences in thinking and culture, they will get exacerbated because everybody is frazzled. So it's important to try and take some time out. And I think it's one of those things that when we've got waiting lists, busy caseloads, we don't have the time, but somebody within the organisation needs to have that as part of their responsibility to keep those relationships going, because it's identifying where it's working well. Again, it's that strengths-based approach. It's think about all the examples where it's worked well and what are those elements that could be translated more widely to address the issues where it isn't working so well. And if we just think, you know, hospitals are about fixing people, their focus is about getting people out as quickly as possible, getting them medically well enough to get out as quickly as possible. You know, and occupational therapists and social work colleagues are sort of key in helping that safe discharge, that transition over to services in the community. And often now that is based across health and social care. You know, I'm thinking about the primary care element in particular. So it's sort of, you know, it is identifying, you know, from a social care point of view, you're thinking, well, what matters to the person? What's important to them? What have they already got in place? What is it they'll want to do when they get home? But from the hospital staff, it is about, is this person safe enough? Will this be a safe or unsafe discharge? So it's just a very different viewpoint. And the only way you can get some synergy is by having those conversations and thinking about what are our shared goals. So a bit of a waffly answer, but I hope that covers some of it as well. We are thinking about, we've done an informed view around sort of home first, discharge to assess, which is really just giving a steer from the college to help people think about reviewing their services. But we're also thinking about, are there further resources? And in particular, we're working with NHSI on that because, you know, they're picking up that this is a real issue for hospitals discharging.
Thank you. I see that a question, an actual question, has popped in from Robin, our next speaker, but it's kind of to both of you, and I think it's quite a good one to say. It says, how do Fran and Karim view the integrated care systems and how principal social workers and OTs have a positive influence?
So shall I start with that, Karen? So hello, Robin. It's nice to see you. So integrated care systems, are you talking about, so if you're talking about the wider kind of systems, then actually it's really important that people work in an integrated way. We all know that, we don't have to kind of repeat that, that's just better for people. Whether people should structurally integrate or not, I think is a different matter. I don't think necessarily, I think if we look at things like Buurtzorg and some really successful ways in which people have worked with communities, actually it's not been about structural integration, it's been about relationships built between the professionals to integrate and make sure that they're far more joined up. And to me, the idea that, you know, you could do this without your health and your occupational therapy kind of professionals, you just can't do your job without it. So it's an absolute essential and critical way forward. And I think when we talk about integrated systems, we should be able to articulate locally what we mean and stop trying to spend huge amounts of resources structurally bringing people together, but really tell a story a bit more about, you know, when it works well, this is how good it looks. And this is what integrated systems are really all about. And that's kind of my view on it. I don't know about you, Karen.
Absolutely, and I think there's a real concern, you know, within social care with ICSs that they get swallowed up. The NHS is this behemoth that's going to just overtake everything, but you have got soft power. You really understand communities, your local communities, the needs of your local population. You really understand what people value to have quality of life day to day, living in their own home environments, community environments. So I think you can influence through your relationships, as Fran was saying. I think that's a real strength. I think you need to have confidence within that. You're never going to be a bigger beast than the NHS. And I think it's accepting that, but thinking where is your soft power, where can you influence and guide to change the thinking. And one of the pieces of work that college is doing is we're involved in the task force looking at long COVID and recovery, and we're looking at the needs in terms of community rehabilitation. And we have been able to use and cite the reablement model that works really effectively, where you have got, you know, occupational therapists, other professionals leading with the reablement, but then delegating to reablement workers, and so that you're using your expertise well. So I think we have to be really clear as occupational therapists and social workers, where is our expertise, and tell people about that, explain that and demonstrate it, working to the top of our license and saying we can't do everything, but what we can do is, you know, be accessible, tap into our expertise, because I think that's where you extend your influence as well.
Thank you, Karen.
I love that soft power. That's a great term, isn't it? I remember being a social worker and intermediate care team, and I was the only social worker in a team of about 25 different kind of professionals. But I didn't mind to me, because I knew what I kind of brought, really, and I knew the value I kind of had and what I could bring to kind of change and influence. So I like that notion of soft power.
Andrew, we have got a particular theme in the chat, and I'm just wondering whether, Fran, you could perhaps answer a couple of questions. One was particularly around the use of assistive technology, and how do we move forward in terms of new technology and new advances, particularly after COVID. And another one was in relation to the PSWOT 80-20 study, if you're aware of anything that's coming down, anything that we can take part in across the region.
So on the second one, I'm meeting with BASWA about this shortly, so I will have probably some more information about that later on. I haven't got a huge amount of information about what's going to be kind of like drawn down from that nationally. The assistive technology bit is really interesting, isn't it? Because we were already developing, well before COVID, a different type of response in terms of assistive technology, not to replace human contact, but just to make people's lives better, more independent. And there is some fantastic stuff out there. And I think what the pandemic showed us was that we can just use it much better and much more creatively. And yes, there will be new things coming on board. I'm absolutely certain of it after the pandemic. But actually, it's always about looking at how it supports, but how it does so in a very holistic way with a person. So it's not just kind of like another tick box. I can remember a period of time. This is with my other hat on, with my leadership role at Thurrock, where assistive technology was something that we made everybody tick on an assessment that they'd kind of looked at. And you know, when I look back now, I kind of think, yeah, I was one of the people that said, yes, you must consider it. And it was probably during the beginning bit of austerity when we realised we didn't have a lot of resources. So we're thinking we must try and find alternative resources. That's not how to do assistive technology. You can't just go in and sort of say, right, everybody's got to have a bit of assistive technology. So it's always got to be really strength focused, really kind of individually focused about how you use it. And I'm absolutely certain that there will be lots of new innovations, and the way we use it ourselves is just all really, really positive.
Brilliant. I've also got another question as well, and that's particularly to both of you, I guess. How do we raise the profile? Because we try hard as a region, but how do we raise the profile of social work and OT, particularly after COVID, amongst community members, other professions and what have you, particularly if we're looking at ICS models?
So my first thought on that is that principal social workers and social work voice has to be really in there at those ICSs, and they are meant to be integrated. They are meant to be equally social care and health. And if locally that's not happening, that's where you can influence and make sure that that's there. So make sure you're there, you're in the planning, and that you're doing things, because you can't influence it unless you're around the table. So that's really, really important. Wider, kind of like joined up kind of influencing, that comes just from the sort of thing you're already doing, which is to make sure that real visibility of the occupational therapy and the social work kind of contribution is just, you're shouting about it, you're promoting it, you're making sure people are aware of it. But most of all, it's got to be there at that leadership.
Fabulous. We've also just had a question in from Robin. So COVID has highlighted social inequalities and indeed made many of these even worse. So what is the role of OTs and social workers in shaping communities to address inequalities?
I'll come in on that one, because it's very close to my heart, because we're doing a lot of work around this. So actually we are preparing a report ourselves on how occupational therapy can address health inequalities. And we've been doing a piece of work with Public Health England and the King's Fund, looking at the AHP role with health inequalities. A lot of what we do inadvertently addresses health inequalities, but often we don't recognise that that's what we're doing. It's not the sole purpose of our work, but actually we are working with people with the most complex needs and most in need. So I think we need to recognise it and think about what can we do more effectively to directly address those social determinants, for instance. Public Health England King's Fund are publishing a framework to enable individuals and services to directly address health inequalities, and also pulling up the evidence. And then obviously our report will follow through in the autumn, which will look specifically at occupational therapy. And I think just that point around technology, what we really need to be mindful of is that it does work very effectively for some people, but people who are struggling, who are experiencing health inequalities, sometimes do not have access to the technology, do not have confidence or education to use the technology. So we need to make sure that we aren't inadvertently excluding the people most in need. And I think, it's very easy to get swept up. The virtual sort of conversations and touch points we've had with members has really highlighted that sort of digital technology has been great for connecting teams and that work. But everybody sort of identified that, if we're taking that strengths-based approach, we have to understand the person we're working with, their experience and attitude to technology first, because that needs to dictate whether we use and how we use the technology. For some people, it has to be that face-to-face contact.
Fabulous, thank you. And I've got a bit of a personal question from a PSW point of view in relation to the National Health Check and the standards for employers of social work. Just to ask, is there any themes that are coming down from that at the moment? Anything that you're aware of?
So there's going to be another webinar coming up shortly, which I'm really hoping I'll be able to fit that into chair that. That's I don't know whether any of you managed to get to the last health check webinar where the kind of key themes were kind of were already starting to be disseminated down. Everybody should have had their individual ones, and everyone should have had their regional ones, and then you've got the national ones. So absolutely, the idea of that is to pull together some of the real key themes. I think possibly it's probably that's great, but I think locally it's better to hang on to your local figures and kind of look at what you need to do more locally. But I think, yeah, nationally, definitely. And working with the LGA on this, I think that's been a really positive experience. It's been the best kind of health check, I think, results that we've ever had. So the whole review of it has been really welcomed by our office.
Fabulous, thank you. No more questions from me?
I'm going to jump in if I may, Karen. Just following up what Fran was saying about raising profiles, and this is a challenge that we see in occupational therapy regularly, which is why this event on its own is so encouraging. I wondered, both Karen and Fran, have you got any tips? Because bearing in mind our audience is a mixture of managers, commissioners, PSW, social workers, occupational therapies. Have you got any pragmatic advice or practical advice how staff can bring attention to their work? Because we often come out with leadership advice, which is great, and I'm thinking particularly around AHP councils, for example, which is good to get involved with the ICSs and so on. Anything pragmatic for frontline staff about how they can raise the profile of their work and draw attention? I love the fact that we're working together so closely, and that should continue, but anything for individuals perhaps?
Yeah, I think we need to actually have the confidence and take the time to think about how can we promote the pieces of work that we're doing. And I think sometimes we quietly get on with it and we're delighted that it's working well, but actually we need to and assume other people will notice. But I think we actually need to think, actually, who could we communicate this with, and how do we have conversations within our organisation to promote work to the public? So it's thinking about, you know, local news stories, items on ITV News, BBC News locally as well. And I think we're often a bit anxious. For occupational therapists, it's because our anxiety is that nobody's heard of us, and for social workers, it's a mixed bag in the media. But it's thinking, how can we do that? Thinking about trade magazines, you know, our internal communications. How do we shout about what we're doing well? I think there is a bit of perhaps a British modesty that we shouldn't, but I think we should. And also a concern about, can we ask the people that we work with to talk about their experiences as well? We're reluctant to do that. We're very protective. But when people have had a good experience of services, often they are delighted to be asked about it and to talk about it. So I think we need to be a bit more confident about asking the people we work with, would you be happy to speak about or to give us a quote or to be interviewed about your experience? Because I think we need to promote the good news stories rather than just, you know, concentrating on the challenges. Again, it's that strengths-based approach right the way through.
Thanks so much, Karen. Absolutely, so much of that resonates. Fran, do you have any comments?
Well, I'm trying to reflect on what it was like my very early days in Department of Health and Social Care, where, you know, people speak a different language as well. And I think there's something about, so I completely agree with everything Karen has said around we shouldn't be modest. We should absolutely shout about what we do and why it's really, really important. We have to make the links, those leadership links, but we also have to make those community links as well. So from the top, if the leadership links are there, and then if your OTs and your social workers also community links are there, you're getting the voice from both sides, and that's equally as powerful. It's really important to tell stories, and one of the things I've found is the most powerful thing, and what I've done at DHSC, is to tell stories and to put it in real life context as to why it is that we're absolutely pretty indispensable when it comes to any type of healthcare, because actually social care and healthcare is definitely interlinked. So so putting it into stories, challenging the use of language as well a lot of the time is really important. Kind of, we talk sometimes in different language, and it's not about us saying one's better than the other, but it's a bit about us saying, like, this is how we describe people, which is different to the way you describe people. So stories are really, really powerful. Challenging the language. My very early days in DHSC, I did a presentation on, it's similar to Alan, it's a lot more in detail, on a woman called Juliana who was trafficked to the country. And now people wouldn't necessarily think, when they think in the DHSC, that that's what social care is dealing with, because they think of older people in residential care generally. So actually it's just about opening people's eyes to the fact that what we do, the breadth and the depth of adult social care. And then the final thing I'd say is always come back to the wellbeing principles of the Care Act, because that's our statutory framework. And actually everybody has a duty under the Care Act. So if we stick to that, we can't go either.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. It's good. It's just for people to know what practical difference they can make. Sometimes I think perhaps they feel a bit stuck. So that's great advice from both of you. Thanks so much.
I was going to come in as well, if that's okay. It was kind of coming on a kind of a similar theme, really, and I suppose it's potentially some final kind of takeaways and to-dos, really. I suppose any kind of advice you can offer social workers or OTs, kind of individually or kind of collectively, really, in terms of how we can kind of support strength-based practice and strength-based kind of work, and really just be nice to kind of hear your kind of final insights, really.
So shall I start? So the first thing I would say as social workers or as OTs, I would just say, one of the first things you need at the moment is to be really looking after yourself and, and spending some time reflecting both in your supervision, in your teams, reforming your teams again, and also just getting back to some sort of normality to where we were before. It's going to be challenging and it might be quite painful, but look after yourself and draw on all the possible support that you can get. In terms of practicing strength-based, I just think that really key thing is that you always look at somebody and what they can do and not what they can't. And that message that I always found really powerful from, and I remember hearing this from Math Pots at Camaradas. If you haven't looked at Camaradas, then do look at them. They're a fantastic organisation and very, very clear about that. Just stop trying to fix people. When you go into a new relationship, when you're as a practitioner going to see somebody, don't go in with the view that you're going to fix all the things that are wrong with them, because they don't want it. They don't. That's not actually what our care and support is about. Just go in with that, human to human contact. Get to know somebody. It takes longer time, but actually the outcomes are so much more positive in the long run. Investing the time in the beginning to build that relationship early on is much more important. And if you've got your managers shouting down your neck that you've got a huge amount of other stuff that you've got to be getting on with, then talk about that investment in the time and getting to know somebody, and that longer term outcomes would be much better. And just basic fundamental things like, if it was you, if it was your mum, if it was your daughter, if it was your brother, how would you want a social worker to approach them? The biggest compliment ever, I think, is when somebody says, "Sure, I wouldn't mind you being my social worker." In your kind of relationships with your normal peers. If somebody said, "God, if I was a social worker, if ever in need of support, I'd love you to be my social worker," they're seeing something in you that is a lot more than just ticking a few boxes.
I agree with Fran, and I think I'd sort of say go back to that slide that I gave. Just what are the questions? What's supporting? What's hindering a strengths-based approach? Just thinking about your beliefs, your assumptions, and the team that you're working with, and those sort of shared practices. I think sort of on an individual level, when you're working with a person, I always find the PEO model really useful. So it's thinking about the person, what matters to them, who they are, the occupation, that's the O, what is it that they want to do, what do they value, and then the environment, is it supporting or hindering that person to do what they value? And the environment isn't just a physical environment, it's the social environment, it's everything around us. And I think if you break things down with that approach, then it really helps you to unpick and support somebody to move forward.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both very much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure. There's a quick question in the chat from Amy. Fran, she's asking, what was that organisation you said?
Camarados. So if you type into Google Camarados, they'll come up. It's camarados.org, I think. But they're also on Twitter. Absolutely fabulous. They're a movement, not an organisation, and they are all people with lived experience. And they do things called public living rooms, which are where you literally just set up a public living room and you just leave it be, and people just come and do amazing things together in those public living rooms and talk to one another. And you don't bring professionals into it at all. You stay well away, and people start to kind of like build real connections. So yeah, Camarados, and their number one thing is you don't fix people.
Take a look, everybody, have a look at that, really. But thank you very much again. I'm going to give you some applause. And thanks for joining us here in the West. Well, I say in the West Midlands, where everybody is really, I suppose, really. We were going to take a break, I think, at about 11 to 11:15. So a little bit ahead of ourselves. So I'm going to ask my colleague Pete, what do you reckon about a 15-minute break, Pete, till about 11:05? And I'm also giving Robin out there, Robin Miller, just a chance to say, does that work with you? Robin is kind of following on after the break. Just a chance to see if that's okay. If I don't hear otherwise, I'm going to
take it as a yes.
Exactly, Pete. I'm going to take it as a yes. Robin, all good. Okay, so if it's okay, we shall take a little break there. If everybody can come back at about 11:05, take a bit of a comfort break. You can stay logged on if you want to. Just keep your cameras off and muted, and we'll be back at 11:05.
Lovely to see those speakers earlier, and we will be circulating slides. I see that's popped up in the questions quite a bit, so Shelley will be getting those slides round after the event for you to reflect on, which is brilliant. Some really good points that were made. I mean, a few that caught my ear particularly were around practice and the challenges facing practice. Some really evocative notes there around resilience, particularly. I think that's being felt by everybody, and the need for both staff and residents too, for that to be a consideration in how we move practice forward, and making sure to check in with colleagues definitely resonated with me. And I really like Karen's point about recognising the soft power too. That was a new one to me, and I think a few people mentioned that in the chat as well. And that's so true, isn't it? Because as community-based workers, we do know our communities and we understand their needs, and therefore we need to plan about how to move forward to support them after COVID. So that really makes your work, Robin, all the more relevant, given where we are now, post-pandemic, almost.
Yep.
Almost. So can I hand over to you? Really great to see you, Professor Robin Miller from the University of Birmingham, and I'll leave you to talk through your slides if that's all right.
Okay, thank you very much. And Shelley, do you want to go forward onto the first one? That's great. And just say thanks ever so much, Pete and Andrew et al. For the opportunity to come and speak to you today about our research project. And we're in the first year of a 3-year project, so hopefully we'll get invited to come back in future years and to share more detailed findings. For people who don't know me, my name is Robin Miller. I am Professor of Collaborative Learning at the University of Birmingham and based in the Department of Social Work and Social Care. I've been there for about 10 years, but for the 15 years before that, I worked across West Midlands as a social worker, as a team manager, as a commissioner, and a senior leader in health and social care. And in many ways, the challenges that I experienced when I was working in the front line and in management are what inspires me in my research career. A couple of points before we get going. First of all, you won't just hear from me today. You'll also hear from my colleague, Sharanya. And our colleague, Ela, is also part of the research team, and she's in the chat, so she'll be able to respond to questions too. And I'll pick up on some of the points that Karen and Fran so helpfully made in the first half of the session. But just one thing to highlight now, their emphasis on the importance of all of us in social care, but particularly social workers and occupational therapists, being much more proud and confident in what we do and be willing to share learning. And one of the things that we're very keen on doing at the University of Birmingham is to try and connect up with our partners across the world. And we've organised something called a University 21 network of social work and social care departments. And we were speaking to them just yesterday in an international symposium on strength-based practice. And one of the things we shared was the endeavours in the West Midlands to try and achieve more consistency in how we support families and individuals in this way. And they were incredibly impressed, I think, at the scale of the endeavour. And also, interestingly, at the fact that we have got a bit of legislation in the CARE Act that actually embeds this in the legislative process, which again was a real revelation to many of the people on the discussions yesterday. So something to be proud of, and there's going to be more opportunities to share as we go forward. Do you want to go forward a slide, please, Shelley? So who are we? Well, so I'm based at the University of Birmingham, as is Sharanya, and Ela's based at the University of Warwick. And we're part of something called the NIHR West Midlands Applied Research Collaboration. And this is a 5-year research programme between the universities of Keele, Warwick and Birmingham, which tries to understand what's important to our local health and social care practitioners and policy communities, and then to undertake research projects that are relevant to them in terms of their work. And I would just do a little bit of a diversion before we go on to the project to say there has never been a better time if you are at all interested in undertaking social care research to start to participate. There's huge amount of new opportunities for funding grants, for fellowships, for PhD studies and so on. And so if you're at all interested in how you can participate in research, either as a researcher or indeed as somebody who contributes to the delivery of research, please do get in contact and we'll link you up with these opportunities, because there really has never been a time like this in terms of adult social care research, including, importantly, occupational therapy. So little call there for people who are interested in research to get in contact. So Shelley, do you want to go forward on this slide? So what we're going to cover today. So first thing we're going to do is give you some insights to what is the research that we're carrying out. And we're delighted to be doing this in partnership with the PSW and the OT network, and indeed the commissioning network. Then we're going to talk a little bit about why we think this is such an important topic for us to spend the next 3 years looking at. We're going to reflect on what research has been done previously. And then we're going to share some of the emerging findings and a definite health check. These are emerging findings. We're still in the midst of data analysis in terms of our initial interviews. And then we'll summarise by the next steps of the research and hopefully give you an idea of how you can contribute going forward. So here is the overall topic that we're looking at. What can be learned from the implementation of strength-based practice in adult social care in the West Midlands? Now, I'll talk to you in a minute about why we're not looking at while we're looking at implementation in particular. You'll notice from this, what we're not looking at in this research project is what are the outcomes and the effectiveness of strength-based practice. And that's not because those are insubstantial topics, and they are ones that need to be researched more thoroughly. And indeed, we're doing a big project currently with 3 local authorities in the UK to look at what are the outcomes for individuals and the economic benefits of doing strength-based practice. And the 3 authorities we're looking at are ones that have combined a number of different asset-based interventions. So that is a very important topic, and we certainly do need more evidence of what the different benefits are for different approaches to strength-based practice. But in this project, we're going to be looking at the implementation in particular, and I'll just explain in a minute why that's the case. Next slide, please, Shelley. Here's our definition of strength-based practice. I mean, as ever, being academics, we do love our conceptual definitions. And to devise this, we drew on many of the existing influential pieces, both by practice people such as Skye and Ritva, but also the more of the academic literature and social work and social care to develop our interpretation of what strength-based practice is. And from our reading of what people have written before and the different theoretical frameworks, there's a number of key elements. There are a focus on what matters to the individual, facilitating and discovering individuals' abilities and strengths, resources, and informal networks, to develop an egalitarian, trusting, and collaborative relationship between the practitioner and the individual, and connecting with wider formal and informal systems within local communities. And in many ways, strength-based practice is a set of principles. It's a set of underlying sort of ethical approaches that people should be using to guide their practice, whatever professional background or setting they're engaging with individuals and their families. Next slide, please, Shelley. And just in terms of implementation, again, what we're looking at is we're thinking about the different plans, the resources, the different activities that organisations and indeed wider partnerships deploy to try and facilitate strength-based practice in the work of their practitioners, their teams, and their services. Okay, next slide, please. And what we want to do in this research is to think about strength-based practice across the social care system in particular, but also to some extent respect the health and social care system as a whole. And we already heard from Karen and Fran the importance of systems working and the emphasis in current government plans and policies. And I think social care, again, one of the things that we do very well is we understand that although our work as individual practitioners is very important and makes a real contribution, actually we are part of a larger system. So within the local authority, we not only have the professionals, but we also have the commissioners and their role in terms of shaping the market. We work very comfortably, I think, with the voluntary and community sector, and I've had many decades of experience of understanding the strengths that the voluntary and community sector can bring to supporting individual communities, and also how we can engage with them positively in what we do. And then the final thing that we do have to recognise as hugely important, and we think we do in social care, is the role of independent providers. For many people, the day-to-day contact they have with social care services is not through the occupational therapist or the social worker, but actually it's through the independent care agencies who support them in their own home or indeed in supported accommodation or indeed residential care. And our basic assumption is that if we don't get strength-based practice embedded across all these parts of the system, then the outcomes and the benefits for individuals and families will not be fully realised. So a really core part of our project, which is actually very different to what's been done previously, is that we do want to understand how strength-based practice is being introduced across the social care system and to understand how we can do that better in the future. Next slide, please, Shelley. And so the project's got 3 stages, and we're coming towards the end of stage 1. And the first stage is very much setting a foundation for the other 2 years. So over the last 6 months, we've been speaking to a lead from each professional group within each of the local authority areas. And we know in some areas we've got different configurations joint with health about their interpretation of strength-based practice, how they've tried to introduce that into the work of their teams and in terms of their different services, and also to understand their current learning and challenges to do that. So we've undertaken an interview with a principal social worker, a lead OT, and a commissioner from each local authority area. And we're also doing some secondary data analysis just to understand the context in which each local authority is practicing. Not necessarily to say, well, this approach to implementation leads to these outcomes as recognised by ASCOF, etc., but just to understand the kind of stage of progress that we can learn from those different sets of data. And once we've completed all the analysis of this, we'll then go on to what I think will be possibly one of the most interesting parts of the research. Is we're going to do surveys across local authority staff with independent care providers and with our voluntary and community sector partners to get their engagement with strength-based practice. So we've heard in this first stage from the strategic leaders about how they are trying to change what happens in the front line and the difference that they're hoping that's going to make to individuals and families. For the next stage of the research, we'll be doing surveys across all the professional groups in both the independent, the voluntary and the local authority sectors to understand the extent to which they have been supported and encouraged and facilitated in moving to more of a strength-based approach, and what would help them to do that even better. And then stage 3, we'll be picking out some case studies of different implementation approaches and engaging in a very rich way with the people involved in that, and also speaking crucially to people with lived experience and family carers of how they've experienced those changes in practice. So that's the 3 stages of the research, which roughly relate to one year per stage. Go forward, thanks, Shelley. Next slide, please, Shelley. Fantastic. So why is this an important topic? Next slide, please, Shelley. Great. Well, back fun. So the first thing is that just improvement and indeed implementation is notoriously difficult. And you can look across any sector, not just the health and social care sector, but particularly the health and social care sector, and find countless examples of where we have known that something isn't working, and we've had a reasonable idea of how we're trying to make that better. But actually, what we've struggled to do is to implement that on a kind of consistent basis at scale and to embed that in how we go forward. And I don't say that in any kind of way which is critical for a personal basis, because when I was a manager and I was a commissioner in social care, indeed integrated health and social care, I did have some things that worked, but I had a lot more things that didn't actually have much traction going forward. And it's actually incredibly difficult because there's so many factors that you have to influence and change when you try and improve what you do and to make that more sustainable. And part of that is that we don't necessarily understand the complexity of what we're trying to achieve, and we don't understand and apply the rigor that we need to improve it. So there's a general thing about improvement and implementation are difficult, and therefore adding new learning to those is going to be really helpful. Next slide, please, Shelley. Next slide, please, Shelley. Oh, nope, forward. That's great. Okay, the second reason we're going to do it is that it's a really important topic in the West Midlands. And as I said, the West Midlands Applied Research Collaboration, we started off with our practice partners in the shape of ADASS and the Principal Social Worker Network and the OT Network. And we said to them, what would you like us to study? We've got some resources, we've got some time, what would be important to you? And it was really pleasing that what they came back with was we want to understand strength-based practice and how we're approaching it. We recognise that each local authority is seeing this as a priority, but we're all doing it slightly differently. We're all trying to embed this through different supports and different approaches. And therefore, the reason we're doing this is because this is what's come from the social care community in the West Midlands, and that's why we're researching it. The next slide, please. And the next, you just go through this slide and put all the things up, Shelley, is that it's also not just a UK aspiration. So we can look across the world. As I said yesterday, we had a seminar only yesterday to look at this. And strength-based practice is something that people want to understand better internationally and how they can embed it. And it's also something that does go across disciplines. We've already heard today about how strength-based practice rings true with OTs, but also underpins social work practice. But it's also in many more disciplines. It's within nursing, it's within psychology. There's a whole strand of leadership that looks at strength-based practice as well. So we believe that we can generate important insights, not just for adult social care, but also these other disciplines and indeed our international colleagues too. Go forward a slide, please, Shelley. And finally, the reason we want to do this is because we've done previous research projects to look at how we try and achieve strength-based practice. And what comes up very strongly is the implementation challenge that is involved with that. So most people would agree this is a good direction to be going in. Most people agree that it's a common set of principles that we can support, but actually how we introduce it is often much more difficult. And we're going to play you a short animation now, which summarises findings for a project that we finished just last year. We've looked at 10 local authority areas and tried to understand how they were trying to move to a new model of adult social care. So if you could play the animation, that would be great. Thanks. So there'll be a short pause while this comes up. Okay, we can't hear it. Okay, I think Shelley's just going to try and get the animation working. That was working well, Shelley.
Many local authorities have been looking at how to enable people to have better lives, with stronger connections in their families and communities, thereby helping to prevent, reduce or delay their need for social care services. We used a national survey to find out how different English local authorities were taking this agenda forward, and also what difficulties they were facing. We then looked in more depth at the experience of 7 local authorities. Since the Care Act, some local authorities have developed a new vision of how they should engage with citizens and communities. Instead of assessing people's eligibility for increasingly scarce social care services, they are seeking to work co-productively with people to enable them to find solutions to their difficulties, build effective support systems, or achieve aspirations, such as getting a job or being able to live more independently. Fundamental to the success of preventative approaches is engaging with citizens in ways that do not inadvertently build dependence, doing with rather than doing to or doing for. A new language is emerging which emphasises people's strengths and assets, mobilising resources and building capability. Interestingly, financial pressures were seen as the biggest driver for investing in prevention activity, but also as the most frequent barrier to implementing this as a coherent strategy. It could be hard to carve out additional money to pump prime upstream prevention, while overall budgets were having to be tightened. From our research in case study sites, our main finding was that you have to be radical to be effective. Piecemeal change delivered little and was often not sustained. 3 approaches emerged as particularly promising. Strengths-based approaches, such as 3 conversations, offer a collaborative approach to finding solutions that enable people to have a good life, often with relatively little involvement of care services. Local area coordination builds capability and connectivity in the community, with people supporting each other around their interests and aspirations. Family group conferencing brings together people with their family and friends to agree support arrangements that will help them to have the sort of life that they want. We found that strengths-based approaches could reduce the use of residential and nursing care and community capacity building linked to lower expenditure on social care and health services. Our recommendations include stronger and more joined-up leadership for prevention at a national level across social care and health, with a particular focus around reducing social isolation. There should be a 5-year funding settlement for local authority social care, as for the NHS, to enable local authorities to develop a strategic approach to prevention. The draft guidance, the Care Act and whole family approaches be formally adopted and promoted across the sector. There needs to be an investment in training and supervision if staff are to be able to deliver new co-productive, doing with ways of working.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, Shai. That's great. So what you'll see from that research project is that we did find that strength-based practice was starting to become embedded, that we can see some very good outcomes from our initial work on what the benefits were, but equally the challenges of how to do that in practice were very strong within each local authority, and that again underpins the need for this research. So Shelley, do you want to go forward a couple of slides? My colleague Shiranya is going to talk about, well, what do we know currently then in terms of implementation of strength-based practice? Over to you, Shiranya.
Right. Thank you, Robin, and hi, everyone. So I will be taking you through the processes along with the findings of our scoping review. So this slide really highlights the difference between a scoping review and a systematic review. And as you can see, a scoping review is considered to be a precursor to a systematic review and really enables researchers to try and understand and clarify key concepts, but also look at the type of research that has been done and what evidence is out there. So this particularly becomes important for us, especially because of lack of clarity with respect to what strengths-based practice really is and the distinctions between person-centered care and strengths-based approaches. But also for our decision to do a scoping review was primarily based on two factors. One being that very early on, when we undertook a brief literature review, we realized that there was very little peer-reviewed research undertaken, especially with respect to the implementation of strengths-based practice in adult social care. Moreover, the context of such research was primarily within social work context rather than the social care context that we were particularly interested in. So it just made sense for us to consider a scoping review. But also with our discussions with our stakeholder groups, it became very evident that there was no consensus on how best to implement strengths-based practice in adult social care. So really, these were some of the factors that provided us the impetus to do a scoping review. Shall next slide, please? Yeah. So in terms of the process, we used ARCC's 6-stage methodological framework to guide us through the process. So the overarching research question, as Robin already highlighted, was really around what do we actually know about the implementation of strengths-based practice in adult social care. But equally, we looked at other questions that included how is strengths-based practice conceptualized within adult social care, what are the different strengths-based interventions or approaches, and how have these interventions been implemented. So we started our initial search for our literature, and we narrowed down from 2,027 abstracts to 33. That's supposed to be 33, based on an inclusion criteria that included all research that was done on and after 2010, which was based within the UK context within adult social care, but more importantly, that considered strengths-based practice as a process and studied strengths-based practice rather than looking or suggesting strengths-based practice to be a recommendation. Some of the databases that we searched include HMIC, Social Policy and Practice, and so on. So based on this, we then came up with certain themes that we will be discussing in the next few slides. Shall next slide, please? Right. So just in terms of the implications before we go on to the findings, so there was very limited academic literature on strengths-based practice and adult social care that you can see from the numbers here. This was generally within the context of social work rather than the context of social care that we are particularly interested in. We also saw that strengths-based practice interventions were assessed more in terms of the effectiveness rather than the implementation, which again is a severe gap in the literature, but also more was said in terms of the context and learning rather than activities and success of the implementation process itself. Yes, so in terms of our findings for the first research question as to how strengths-based practice is conceptualized, there are three key interrelated concepts that emerge. One around independence that really that talks about how strengths-based practice aims to maximize independence along with providing increased choice and improved quality of life for people. But also in terms of control, it wasn't really just about providing control to the service user or the person who's seeking services in terms of how much and what kind of support they want, but really about identifying what being safe means to them and also how much risk they're willing to take except in their lives. The other concept that came across was very strongly was in terms of empowerment, that is really about enabling people to make informed choices, and also the amount of responsibility that they are willing to take in terms of the care needs and care packages that they're looking at. Next slide, shall we? Right. So in terms of the interventions or the approaches itself, our scoping review largely we can divide these interventions largely into two broad categories. One is community-based interventions, such as local area coordination, community-led support. And the other categorization is really in terms of individual-based approaches, something like family group conferencing or even motivational interviewing. I'll talk about that a bit later. Shall next slide, please? Right. So what do we actually know about the implementation process itself? So in terms of the implementation process, we really looked at, this was primarily based on the CFIR framework or the consolidated framework for implementation research that really allowed us to, provided us a guide to look at the barriers and also the facilitators for, for effective implementation. In terms of some of our learnings with respect to the process itself, we see that starting off with one or two sites really gives an opportunity for people to learn and adapt, as against going through a big bang approach and rolling out the process and then coming back and revisiting what some of the changes potentially could be. But also it's about really understanding what already exists within the organization in terms of initiatives so that there is no duplication of processes. Steady pace again becomes very important so as to ensure that the rollout is okay and the system is okay to engage and manage such rollout. But also being part of such regional and national initiatives have been supposed to be very, very useful simply because it provides that practical support and guidance, become aware of what exists and what other people are doing. In terms of outer setting as such, strengths-based values often reflect what those that are held by community organizations and other external partners. Local businesses can be seen as a powerful resource as well because of their community presence, but also because of the resources that they have in general. Also basing local authorities staff across access points in community buildings is supposed to be very useful simply because it increases engagement, it increases presence and also develops those trusting relationships which are very much required within strengths-based principles. And commissioners had also seemed to be very effective in supporting the implementation of strengths-based practice, especially when they're thinking about incentivizing providers and care community and care providers in terms of implementation. But also in terms of the process, in terms of the inner setting in general. Again, a lot of attention should be given to the structural factors, and such structural changes really need to be complemented with cultural changes. So that means to say that culture and behavior become particularly important. In that sense, leadership becomes particularly important again for them to hold the torch together, hold the team together and ensure that strengths-based practice is truly embedded within the process. But it's also important for us to continue to think about the ongoing risk of reverting back to previous practices and systems, primarily because we want to embed strengths-based practice and to understand and address these challenges that may be preventing it. Language again becomes very important, and as Fran stated earlier, stories and practical vignettes also become particularly important to encourage staff and to ensure that strengths-based practice is truly embedded. Shall next slide, please? Yeah, finally, in terms of the approaches that have been studied, as I said, we do have a few community-based approaches that were studied in terms of community-led support, local area coordination, and asset-based community development. But also there are individual-based approaches that include family group conferencing, making safeguarding personal, and motivational interviewing. We also had appreciative inquiry within the review, which again talks about the strengths, assets, and capabilities of the individual organization and the staff, and really to harness these capabilities to improve organizations and make improvements within the organization. Interestingly, what is not studied is the 3 conversations model that is widely adopted within the West Midlands, but that's not something that came across the review. In terms of approaches itself, there are some key elements that were highlighted. And when you think about key elements, service user involvement is very much required and very much part of every process. And especially within the community-based approaches, it becomes important to include service users right from the very beginning in terms of the planning, designing, and the implementation phase. But also one of the key enablers within these approaches is staff training, not just to alleviate anxieties within at the time when you are implementing the approach or introducing a new approach, but to really think about how you can continue to build confidence and to embed strengths-based practice in their daily work. One more thing is also very important, especially within community-based approaches, is to make sure that the local context is at the heart of every implementation and every planning and decision-making process, because that's when it makes more sense. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, that's all from me. Thanks, Robin. Robin, you're muted.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, thanks very much, Joanna. That was a great kind of whistle-stop overview of what we've learned so far from research evidence. So there's been some research done, but not a huge amount, and that's why it's so important that we're going to do this project in the West Midlands. So on to the next slide, please, Shelley. So yeah, so we're going to use this CFIR framework, which Sharanya so well articulated. Next slide, please, Shelley. And yeah, so what have we introduced to so far? So we're trying to speak to at least 3 representatives of each local authority area. We haven't quite got 3 in every area, but we've got 3 in most areas and 2 in all areas. So we're starting to get a really good understanding of the different perspectives of commissioners, occupational therapists, and principal social workers, and how they've implemented strength-based practice. And I'll go through now and just give you some headline findings from our emerging analysis. And just to emphasize again, this is emerging. So in terms of the intervention, a dilemma that came up quite consistently in terms of principal social workers was the extent to which strength-based practice is actually something new. Most people felt that strength-based practice was something that was reflected in the social work profession, its principles, its training, throughout its long life. But actually, they also said there was something different in terms of how we need to embed that more consistently. And often what people said was that strength-based practice is something that we've wanted to do, but actually our systems, our processes have not been in place to enable us to demonstrate that in practice. In terms of occupational therapy, there's a different picture. Actually, the term strength-based practice was not something that occupational therapists often kind of connected with. They said, well, we wouldn't really call it strength-based practice. We'd call it a number of other different terms. And also for us, strength-based practice is absolutely fundamental. It's built into all our frameworks, all our many assessment and planning tools, and just our general way that we work as a profession. So for OTs, there was even a greater strength of, this is perhaps not something new we need to implement, but something that we already do. In terms of why they were doing it, it was often more based on the requirements of the CARE Act in terms of the ethical basis for strength-based practice and also the financial pressures that we touched upon earlier. And interestingly, in terms of which approaches were being deployed, whether it was local area coordination, whether it was a 3 conversations, or whether it was a different approach, that was largely based on their practice wisdom. So it was mostly to do with the kind of view of the principal social worker in particular as to what they think would work best in their local context. And that was built on a number of different things. It was built on partly their previous experience. It was built on discussions with their Director of Adult Social Services. It was from their local West Midlands network and so on. What it wasn't really based on, certainly from our initial findings, was to do with research evidence. That didn't seem to be that key an element in terms of saying, we're going to bring in family group conferencing rather than asset-based community development because research evidence suggests this is strong. And alongside that, there was often different views of the same tools, and 3 conversations is a great example of that. I think in the region, we've got some authorities that have decided 3 conversations is a very helpful structure and have brought that in. We've got other local authorities who've looked at 3 conversations and thought, actually, do you know what? That's okay, but it's not that revolutionary, and we think we can do something better locally. And then we've got people in the middle who I think would like to bring in 3 conversations, but can't find the money, to put it bluntly, and therefore are doing more of a kind of homespun and bespoke approach that builds on 3 conversations, but also takes on some of the local learning. And again, I guess as research is just quite interesting that you can have the same intervention, but 3 different views from people who are all very wise and experienced in terms of adult social care. And that'll be something we can go back to in the discussion. And the final thing in terms of the intervention was there was a much greater focus on the internal practice, particularly on social work and on care planning, rather than the contribution of independent sector providers in particular, and also to some degrees the voluntary and community sectors. So again, a lot of the implementation is focused internally, and that's an obvious place to start. But actually, there's undoubtedly more to do in terms of engaging the rest of the adult social care system and understanding what are the approaches and interventions that will support them to be more strength-based. So go on to the next slide, Shelley. And so what we'll do is we'll send out the presentation rather than go through these in great detail, but we've got illustrative quotes just to back up some of the points that we're making. Okay, next slide, please, Shelley. So in terms of the outer setting, what did we find there? So we've talked already that austerity is a major driver, but also a challenge because it meant that people were having to cope with increasing demands within limited resources. It was often driven by the policy in terms of the lead social worker, and Fran, etc., and also in terms of some of the practice handbooks that we've had developed, the Department of Health and Social Care, people like Skye and RIPVA. Regional networks were seen as incredibly supportive, and I think it's really testament to Andrew, Pete, and the others who do run these networks that people saw this as a great way to gather learning, to share insights, and to take from others in terms of how they were implementing it. Voluntary sector capacity was seen as key, but there was variation in terms of the amount of investment there had been of late in the voluntary sector. And also the difference between, was it a local authority engagement with the voluntary sector, or was it more of a fringe adult social care investment? Also, a lot of discussion about the fact that for many individuals who have social care needs, and indeed for their family, they didn't always understand what the principles behind strength-based practice. And some people understandably come and are expecting to have a particular support. And actually, when the social worker, the OT, or whoever was engaging with them said, well, we're not going to start there. We're going to start with what your aspirations are, what your assets are in terms of your own networks. That could be quite difficult for them because they were often in a time of distress and they weren't understanding what this different way of doing things were. And finally, in terms of the NHS, so we had some examples of where particularly primary care networks and social prescribing were seen as being very helpful and very supportive to strength-based practice in adult social care, but also I have to say quite a few examples of where that felt very much a parallel activity. It didn't really feel joined up in terms of the implementation process. Can you go forward 2 slides, please, Shelley, and the next one? Great. And then And then COVID, we just talked about, we know about COVID being very disruptive. In terms of the intersecting, and we talked about this to some degree with Fran and Lena earlier, that the previous system, the systems that people are trying to introduce strengths-based practice within are often not seen as very supportive. So in terms of the way that people record, the way that people care plan and the way that's recorded in the system, the way that we've had to manage risk, that was not seen previously as being very supportive of strengths-based practice. So in many local authorities, they're starting to try and address that. There is also linked to that undoubtedly an issue in many areas about the confidence and skills of social workers. So having encouraged them to work in a more bureaucratic way, to follow much more of a risk-averse process, we're now asking them to work much more creatively, much more differently in how they support people. And for some, that's something they can take to very easily and readily. But for others, there's a recognition that can be quite challenging. And we need to recognise that and make sure that we give them the supervision and the enablers and the supports to do that. We've talked about the engagement with the voluntary sector. We're also starting to get a real variation in terms of the way that OTs and social workers connect together. So yes, everybody said that was a really important relationship, but the way that was configured in terms of where OTs based within social work teams, were they a separate team, in terms of the extent to which OTs were involved throughout the process or were seen as being much more of a specialist service that came in at a certain point. There was some real variation in that. We think there's going to be some really interesting learning from the survey in exploring that more. Leadership, so again, we talked about that earlier on in today's session, but leadership at a senior level, but also most importantly, perhaps at a practice level, the people who are responsible for overseeing, guiding, encouraging others in their practice, be those OTs or social workers, absolutely set the culture and the climate for change to strengths-based practice. And finally, in terms of the intersecting, I mean, it's really striking how most local authorities are trying to do a transformational change with very little investment. It's often on the basis of people being diverted from previous tasks, from goodwill, rather than a kind of financial resource being provided to achieve this absolutely huge change. Go forward 2 slides, Shelley. And finally, in terms of the process, so a few things there. The first thing is there wasn't always an explicit plan within local authorities for the implementation of strengths-based practice. Some areas did have that, some areas were working on it, but some areas there wasn't particularly a coherent and detailed set of activities. And you can overplay the benefits of having a kind of formal project plan because we know that things have to emerge and often there's complex, unpredictable situations. But I think we probably expected to see much more of that within each local authority. Common set of enablers in terms of looking at systems, looking at training, looking at supervision, and so on. Usually drawing on internal expertise, but sometimes bringing in people from across the region or indeed from more national organisations, generally led by principal social workers. OTs were supportive, but generally it was principal social workers who were driving it. Very few evaluation plans. Again, that's quite common. But one thing that was seen as being consistently helpful was the practice reviews and audits. And that's partly ones that were done internally, but also the ones that have been done in the West Midlands region. And their focus on strengths-based practice and how that is being experienced by both practitioners and by people with lived experience. Do you want to go forward 2 slides? Okay, so that's fine. So where are we so far? So where we are so far is we understand what's been studied before in terms of implementation of strengths-based practice. We're starting to get a sense of how individual local authorities and across the region we've interpreted strengths-based practice across our different professional groups and how we're trying to embed that in what we do. And the next stage, which I think will be really fascinating, is we're going to do these surveys across our internal staff, our independent sector providers and our voluntary community sector, in a way to get the feedback and the experiences from the people who are being asked to implement. So to what degree these different approaches and these different interventions actually ring true with our frontline practitioners, and what can we do differently to try and support them in order to make this change in what they do and how they do it. Shelley, that's the presentation. So I'm sure we rattled through a huge amount of content there. So please come back with any challenges, comments, and we will send out the slides. So there's opportunity to come back afterwards as well. But I'll stop there for just now.
Thanks so much, Robin. I mean, wow, like you say, what an amount of content to take in. All of it entirely relevant, but huge amount of information. A few things that caught my eye. I mean, one of the messages which I know that you and I have talked about before was about how that quote that caught me there was so central to OT it's not talked about, and that for me is about OTs articulating how they work in a strengths-based way, and that's definitely an area that we will take away as learning for the occupational therapists. And one of the principles right at the beginning, so what matters to the individual, that was one of your key principles. And again, that fits so perfectly with occupational therapy, because what we're doing is working with people about meaningful activity. It's that what's right for that person. So lots of link up there. Another one that caught my eye was about how you mentioned the importance of the role of external providers. And again, that's possibly one that we need to really develop, isn't it, with our commissioning colleagues, because easy to overlook, but absolutely vital to the work that's going on. You mentioned social workers and OTs going out to visit people, yes, but actually it's the care workers who are going out day in, day out, hour in, hour out, isn't it? And we need them on board with this most definitely. And before I shut up and hand over to the Q&A, interesting one about how we need to have radical changes to be effective, I thought. No good tinkering around the edges, which, lots of implications with that, aren't there? Which makes your research all the more fascinating, really, about how senior leadership take it forward. So thank you ever so much. Really, really informative. Lots to consider. But I'm going to now pass over to Karen and Joe, if they would, because I'm sure they've been doing a fab job collating and collecting questions for you, if that's all right.
Yep. Thanks, Pete. I look forward to the questions.
Cheers.
Do you want me to go first, Joe? Brilliant. Robin, quite a few questions, so they're all pinging away there. So the first one, how does strength-based practice link to co-production? And also, does it influence other disciplines as well?
Yeah, so great question. So it's interesting. So as Sharanya highlighted, co-production for me is about involving people with lived experience and family carers throughout the whole design and implementation and review of a service. So it's very much not just consulting with people, but embedding their views and their perspectives and shaping what we decide to do and how we do it throughout that. So in terms of strengths-based practice, if you go back, remember what Sharanya was saying, there's a kind of emphasis on some places on the individual approach of working individually with people. And then there's also an emphasis in other interventions in terms of a community-based approach. And I think it's that community-based approach that co-production is absolutely central to. If you look at something like asset-based community development, I mean, that doesn't come from an adult social care background, but it's something that really rings true, I think, with our principles. That is all about starting with communities, finding out what's important to them, finding out what their aspirations are, and working with them to build on those, not doing it for them, but doing it with them. So there's a really good connection with co-production and the principles and processes. And really, you can't do community-based, strength-based practice unless you're co-producing. That's the if you're not co-producing, you just fundamentally haven't understood what it's about and what the benefits are. So that's the first thing. The second thing, in terms of other disciplines learning. So, I mean, again, it's fascinating, I think, as an academic. We've just got, we've got this traditional thing of each profession has got to have its specialist knowledge, and it's got to have its kind of fundamental base of what it does and why it does it. And that's important because we want all our professions to be strong and confident. But the trouble with that is we also know is they then grow up and they train and they learn and they implement in silos. And I think strength-based practice is a really good example of that. And I wouldn't want to accuse OTs and social workers of working in silos between each other. But just the fact that in one of our strong professions, strength-based practice is how we articulate this. In the other profession, that's not how we would say it. That's a fundamental issue. Because if you've got a social worker talking on the ground about a strength-based approach, and OT's thinking, well, what exactly is that? And then you add to that community nursing, and we know in primary care, they tend to be they talk more about assets. They tend to talk about social prescribing. Again, you've got another layer there of a very similar set of principles, but a different way of articulating and understanding it. And why that's a problem, Karen, is because if I'm a nurse and I hear a social worker talking about strength-based practice, I might go, well, that's nothing to do with me because that's social work. But no, it is. And actually, it's what you would say is an important part of your practice as well. And as I said in my previous slide, there's a whole movement in Canada, interestingly, led by this woman, Laurie Gottlieb, and she's introduced a whole model of strength-based nursing. And I've cashed in my money and bought the book. And you know, it's just the same things as we would say in social work and occupational therapy, but she's coming to it from a nursing perspective. And what this means is that, one, in terms of the language that we use and our ability to work together is important to recognise it, but two, there's important learning that we can have. And if we follow the kind of tenet that the OTs have been doing this in their core work with individuals, how they understand people's situation, how they try to support them, well, surely there's going to be learning there that we can then take to our social work colleagues and draw from that, but only if we recognise the similarities in our aspirations. So yeah, I think there's just a huge amount of learning that we're going to get from this.
I think for me that's really crucial as well, particularly if we're moving towards that ICS model. If we can, determine that the principles, the practice and the method of how we do strengths-based practice, but it's a collaborative approach within that model, I think we'd be laughing. Another one, and I think this particularly resonated, was in relation to the leadership. So where we've got particular leadership teams responsible for process, policy, practice, and particularly where they're measuring certain more harder elements in terms of performance. And I think for me, strengths-based practice can often be described as the softer stuff. So how do we change the mindset of our very senior leaders within organisations, and how can we put strengths-based practice as a valuable sort of commodity on the table?
Great. Again, great series of questions. So the first thing I think it's fair to say, and I'm sure if there's anyone from ADASS here, they would all absolutely agree with this, is the strength-based practice is on their table. And for many reasons, including the ethical reason, including the fact it's part of the CARE Act, but also including the fact that actually if we are providing support to people who don't really need that support and who don't particularly benefit from it, that's a terrible use of our resources. And undoubtedly, when you're a director or another senior role, you have to be aware of resources and the fact that that there's never enough to go round. So I think it is on there. I think it is on their table. I think you're right, though, that what we often measure, and it's one of these old truisms, what we measure is not what matters. And one of the troubles with something like strengths-based practice is the kind of quality of life and the importance of what this means to people is something that we don't find it easy to gather in. What we find easy to gather in is activity data on the number of care packages, the length of care packages. The classic one, which I have to say the NHS always defaults to, for sometimes understandable reasons, but often very frustrating reasons, as we all know, is how many people were admitted to hospital and how long did it take to get them discharged. And those are important measures, but they're not the only thing that matters. So there is definitely something in that, Karen. And there's different ways we can look at doing that. One, I think it's important to always have a mixed approach to understanding what we do and what difference it makes. So yes, things like stories, things like etc. are important counterbalances some of the data. There's also measures that we can potentially deploy, and I know a couple of authorities in the West Midlands are looking at this. There's things like capability measures, which basically look at what is it people could do for themselves, what's important to them, and there's some very simple tools that then transfer into numbers, which you can then collate across a large population. And the final thing is in terms of leadership. So yes, senior leadership is absolutely vital, and that's what's been found in previous researches. But actually, what really makes a difference are the practice leaders. It's those people in occupational therapy, in social work, and in nursing indeed, who oversee the work of their other practice colleagues, who support them, who give them time to reflect, who bring them together in the teams, because we know that when teams work together, that's the most incredible environment to be creative, to do things differently. And when teams are dysfunctional, it's a very difficult climate. So those practice leaders are absolutely central to strength-based practice and adopting its principles. But we often don't give those practice leaders the opportunity to reflect themselves on their leadership, on what is it they need to do differently. And it's one of those classic things, we often, people get promoted and they get thrown in the deep end, and sometimes they take to quite a lot of it naturally, sometimes they don't, but they kind of find their own way, but they could undoubtedly do that better and stronger. And it can be quite a lonely place, can't it? We know, being responsible for the work of others and trying to soak up the anxiety and to try and encourage them to do something differently. So I've got a real affinity, I think, and a real kind of sort of want to support people in those practice leadership positions and to give them time to reflect and also learn, because we've got a huge amount of learning from other leadership research and theories that they can deploy in their practice.
Fabulous, thank you. If we can just hand over to my colleague Joe.
Hi, Joe.
Thank you. You very nicely covered the question aspects there, Karen. I think the other theme that I picked up was around community engagement and voluntary sector side of things. I mean, Sharon's talking about a new community network support in Birmingham that's doing some rebuilding, the use of voluntary sector, and also people raising. I'm sorry, I think it might have been Stephanie who raised about being careful not to rely too much on the goodwill of the community if we're not investing in it, and things. So though perhaps you'd like to talk a bit more around that, because those are more big questions.
Definitely, Joe. I think I can hear myself echoing. I don't know if your speaker's on, but yeah, one of the troubles when you're presenting on this format is you see all the questions coming in, but you try not to get distracted. So yeah, so I think in terms of the voluntary community sector, again, nobody would disagree. The voluntary community sector is a really important part of a local system for social care, but also just broadly in terms of the well-being of that area. But we need to go beyond that, seeing the voluntary community sector just as a good thing to have. And we need to understand the very real practical challenges that they have. There's often a misnomer that volunteering is somehow a free endeavour. And I've heard, not many, but in my time, I've heard a few commissioners say, oh, it's great working with the voluntary sector, because basically you kind of get something for nothing. So you don't have to pay these people, but they come in and they'll support some of the people we'd have to pay for otherwise. But that is just not the case, is it? Because to support volunteers, you need to recruit volunteers, you need to train volunteers, you need to support volunteers, you need to oversee their work, you need to respond to their crises. So we need to recognise that it does require investment, and it requires investment that people can rely upon. If you're going to grow a volunteer organisation, and if you're going to develop an ongoing relationship with the community, if we only have contracts that work on a year-by-year basis, that makes it very difficult, because we know that no sooner do they get going and they start to do some good work, they're worried about their time coming to an end, staff leave, there's uncertainty, etc. So this requires a really long-term strategy, I think, from commissioners in particular, and also the wider local authority, in terms of what is their aspiration for the role of the community and voluntary sector, and for that to be co-produced, to go back to what Karen was saying earlier, in terms of that's not something that we just say to people, this is what we want you to do. We go out and we say to communities, what is it that you would like to do, and how does that ring true with us? And on a kind of practical practitioner basis, what's really interesting is that in terms of implementing strengths-based practice, what works really well is when the frontline workers have some time to go out into their local communities and to get to know what's going on the ground. And it's incredible. I was a social worker for many years, and often you start in an office, you're based in the office, you go out and see individuals, you don't necessarily know what's going on in your local area. So actually, although it takes a bit of time and that's an investment, giving people the opportunity to go out into local communities, to go down what used to be the library, although we're struggling with libraries now, aren't we? But to go around the local community centres and just talk to people to find out what's happening, to develop those relationships, that's what's at the heart of strengths-based practice. And that's what things at local area coordination do well, because they've got somebody who's identified a focal point, who gets to know what's going on, and also can then say, well, look, I've got a number of people coming to me who are, I don't know, from African Caribbean community, who are isolated. How about we try and do something? We try and connect these dots up. We try and do something different that will enable those people to have a chance to get together. So I think it's that bit about workers and indeed leaders and commissioners understanding the complexity and the richness of the voluntary sector and proactively going out, spending time and also investing in them, I think is going to be really important.
Absolutely. Can I just check some of the things that you've referred to? There are quite a few people asking about papers and books that you referred to. So I'm hoping that's all either in the presentation or can be shared with people subsequently so that they get that, because there's a lot of interest around those things.
Yeah, no, I can say what I'll do. I'll make sure I put the very clear references in the presentation. So I think I've just got a picture of them, but I'll put some of I'll put a reference thing at the end so people can link into Joe. And again, any questions, please, people just come back to us, and we're happy to kind of provide things electronically if we can.
That's lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe and Karen.
I think Robin referencing, yes, Robin referencing. as an academic.
It's always important, Andrew. Always important.
Always important. I was just going to ask a quick one. I think it was something kind of Fiona mentioned in the chat about that kind of acknowledgement that many people we work with are already resilient and using their strengths, but are a bit kind of exacerbated when they're coming up against kind of differences. And I suppose it's that kind of recognition of like not being kind of blindly optimistic around kind of strength-based practice, that there's still work to do in terms of the structural differences and barriers, you know, the poverty that exists, the lack of employment, the lack of access to support, the discrimination that kind of people face, really. So I think it was just a comment about kind of, you know, being aware of that, really, when you're kind of working with people.
No, definitely, Andrew. And I think that's one of the understandable criticisms of strength-based practice, particularly individual models, is that you could see it as being an assumption that actually you've got all the resources that you need to address all these inequalities and discrimination that you've suffered for your entire life. And clearly that's not the case. People will have resources, but you're right. I think that's a really important challenge in terms of, yes, we've got to recognise structural inequalities. We've got to recognise those differences. And also we've got to recognise the general austerity that we suffered for so many years. So yeah, no, I think that's a really important point. I wouldn't want to detract from that at all.
Fabulous. Thank you, Robin. Seeing as we're running ahead of time, I'm going to take an unprecedented step and see if anyone's brave to ask a live question. So looking out there, there's an awful lot of people. If anybody is, feel free to raise your hand on the Teams menu, and we'll come to you, and you can put a question to Robin directly if anybody's brave enough.
Or indeed to Andrew and Pete, I would say.
Or indeed to Andrew and I, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, let's open up a bit.
I like your style. I like your style.
It's called distributive leadership. And hopefully we'll get a copy of all the comments in the chat, because I would love time to kind of read through them and respond to people individually. So I don't know if Shelley's going to do that, but that'd be great if she could.
That would be great. Yeah. I mean, look, while we're waiting for people to put their hands up, I mean, my one really was just to ask. You've obviously said you're coming to the end of year one. Is there any learning so far that's relevant to practice that you would point people towards, especially?
Yeah, well, I think that's a good one. In terms of practice, of kind of frontline OTs and social work.
Absolutely, something pragmatic perhaps that people can keep in mind.
So I think it's not a new suggestion as such, but I think it's that bit about recognizing that whether we see this as something entirely new, partially new, or something that we've been doing for many years, there's a constant learning that we need to do about how we positively engage with people, how we consider community resources, how we deal with risk creatively. And I think it is that bit about having time for reflection, and both as an individual worker, but also as a team. And you know, we know that with one of the troubles with virtual working, although it's had its strengths, I think those connections between us and some of those discussions you would have probably had in the office that you're not having now because you're not seeing each other regularly have been lost. And I think there's a real need to reintroduce that and to make sure that we do put aside, you know, an hour a month or an hour every couple of weeks to come together and to reflect upon that. Because one of the things that I think we used to, in a way, benefit from as in the old days when it was much more of a process of care management, was that there was kind of like a number of steps you had to go through, and each person was different, but there was a number of processes you went through, and they came up with when I first started, there was basically a checklist of about 6 things people could have, and it was which one did you want and how much did you want of it. But we know that's completely different now, isn't it? We know that's ethically wrong, and it's wrong in terms of people's outcomes, and it's wrong in terms of use of resources. And therefore, that's more challenging. And I don't think we should ignore that. It is, you know, to be more creative and to do something less certain is individually more difficult than it was when you used to follow the process. It's much more satisfying, rewarding. It's why we came into these professions, but it is more challenging. So I think that's probably the main thing I would say. And that's true for implementation as well, is that, you know, if you bring in a new particular process, again, you need to have time to reflect back and say, okay, so what went well with that? What didn't go so well? How can we tweak it? And it's just having that kind of constant culture of we're doing things, we're trying our best, we're standing back, we're reflecting, we're learning, we're going on to the next element of that and the next stage of that. I think that's really key.
Thanks, Robin. I mean, I'm hearing investment. You're talking about investment, aren't you? And you're talking about time, and also you're talking about continued professional development, which is so key to both professions and colleagues. So yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Thanks so much. I think I'm going to bow out now, because unless nobody's put their hand up, unfortunately, nobody's been brave enough. That means you've answered everybody's question. Oh, we've got one. Look at that. Wonderful. Who's that? Let me just pull up this huge list of people. It's Deb. Deb, would you like to ask?
I thought I'd be brave and ask you a question, Robin. I think I'm interested in, yes, the research is looking at, I think, at practitioners and models within organisations, but the public don't phone us to tell us what they can do well. They phone us asking and focus on a deficit, because they'll phone for a solution. And so at times that could be a conflict. I'm just wondering if the research is looking at perceptions that on that angle.
So yeah, no, again, excellent point, Deb, and it was something we picked up in terms of the interviews that you know, for many individuals and families, that's not what they're expecting. What they're expecting is that they come to an OT and classically they get an adaptation or an aid or some other kind of very practical output. So no, I think that's a very important issue, and I guess we didn't hear a lot, I have to say, from the interviews, how the implementation strategies within local authorities were geared towards communicating with the public, which one could see as being an important element of it. So that wasn't something that we heard very strongly, I would say, within the general implementation approaches. So that's just a general point, and I think it's something I'll go back and reflect upon from your question. But when we go forward to the third stage, and the third stage we'll be looking at case studies of different hopefully successful implementation approaches. We're going to speak much more to people with lived experience and family carers there. So hopefully then we'll get a bit more of the sort of nuance from them about, well, was this what you were expecting as you set out? What was it that from the practitioner of this social worker, this OT, that actually made a difference to you? You know, did they try and explain it? So we will pick up on that later on. So yeah, so I think a really important point. It wasn't something that we found hugely, in fact, very much at all in terms of implementation strategies. And I look forward to colleagues coming back and challenging me if we missed that and that is the case. But I think it is a really important dynamic. And in a way, in a broader picture, this comes back, doesn't it, to all of our huge frustrations with the lack of settlement for adult social care. And the fact that the settlement just seems to be about, and this is important, you know, whether people can pass on money to their children or not. The reform of social care is just much more fundamental, isn't it, about what it is that we want from a society, what's the contribution of individuals, communities and families, and therefore what's the role of formal services. And if we're not going to have that nationally, that's going to have to be a debate that we have regionally and in the local authorities, I think.
Thank you, Robin. I think we'll take that as a nice kind of summary to kind of end, if that's okay. I think Pete, we're moving into kind of, I think, closing remarks. I think are we going to invite a couple of colleagues to join us at this point?
I think we are. So yeah, just to say thank you so much, Robin. That was a fascinating talk, and the slides are going to be shared obviously afterwards, aren't they? Yep. Your research continues, and you will be updating both the PSW network and the Principal OT network. So yep. and probably coming to the meetings too to present. So if people are listening, thinking they want to hear more about it, get in touch with your lead, and the lead can either put you in touch with you directly or pass on your latest updates if that's okay with you.
That'd be great, and as importantly, fill out the survey in the autumn. Thank you. Absolutely,
most definitely. So yes, thank you ever so much. And I will now hand over to Andrea and Sienna for a wrap up. Thank you both.
Thank you, Pete. Okay, shall I go first, Sienna?
Yeah, go for it, Andrea.
I think I'd just like to say thank you to all our speakers. That's a really great update, Robin. And I think some of the themes that's come through for me today, it's all about collaboration. The strengths-based approach is not just collaborating with the organisation, it's at every single level. It's both with our teams, it's within individuals, and it's with all our partners. And I think a lot of the discussions really resonate for Sienna and myself, who are on this strengths-based approach, and we're really excited about that. So a massive thank you, and I'm going to pass over now to Sienna.
Yeah, such a lot to think about from this morning. And I think for me, that sort of concept of soft power, how we need to be around the table. We know what people value, we're connected with communities, and we need to influence through our relationships and guide thinking. We might feel like a small partner at the table with our health colleagues, but we've got an important voice and we really need to be telling those stories. And I know Andrew and I have done some engagement with our elected members in Walsall, and it was the stories that made the impact, because you can't deny Alan's experience, can you, that we heard about this morning in terms of the impact of, you know, discovering what his strengths were and building on those. And now he's a carpenter. And I know every one of you on this call will be able to think of those stories where you've made a difference and known others make a difference. And that's what it's about, isn't it? And sometimes it's the small things. I was thinking about what Fran said about music for dementia, hugely important, but that can transform somebody's day, can't it? Make them feel more settled, connected. And I'm sure you've all seen YouTube videos around the impact of music in dementia. And I personally connect with that because my mum had dementia as well, and I know music was really important to her, even when she lost speech and she was unable to kind of connect in any meaningful way. It was music that kind of brought her that kind of peace, really. So it's the small things sometimes that make the big difference, isn't it? And the other thing that I've been thinking about is we're not there to fix people. That was a very clear message this morning, wasn't it? That is not our job as OTs or social workers to fix people. It is about better outcomes. And I think what we're learning from the research, it's about how implementation of strengths-based approaches brings about better outcomes. And that's what we're all trying to achieve, isn't it? And I was just reflecting on a conversation that I had with some student social workers yesterday. And one of them sort of posed the challenge to me in terms of his experience on placement. Where's the social in social work? He could see a lot of systems and processes and things that you know, he needed to do and boxes he needed to tick. Where's the social in social work? And I think what we've been hearing this morning is about the importance of relationships, isn't it? And building those relationships to find out what really matters to people. So that was really good to hear. And also a social work student said to me yesterday that one of the first things that he did on his placement was some community mapping. And I was really delighted to hear that the first thing he wanted to do was to see how he could connect people that he was working with, with the assets in the community. So, you know, we're all at different stages across the region, but together we're stronger, learning from each other, learning what works well. So we just want to thank you so much for your time this morning. And really hope it's given you that pause for thought and that time to kind of think about, you know, all of the great work that you do. Because the other thing I want to pick up on is the impact of COVID and what Fran was saying about the importance of well-being and the need to heal. And sometimes we're not very kind to ourselves, are we, in terms of, you know, needing to think about, you know, that. And so let's take that time to reform as teams, to look after ourselves and to, be kind to ourselves and recognise that it's been an unbelievable, 14, 15 months, been under a lot of pressure, all of us on the call. And, let's kind of reform stronger together. And I'm going to hand over to Andrea because we've probably got a few more thank yous to say. You know me, I can talk forever.
Okay. Yeah, just once again, I'd also like to remind people to fill in the evaluation at the end. It's really important, and we really appreciate everybody's contributions. We appreciate all of the presentations and the questions, and also thank you to our facilitators for facilitating those questions so well. So a big thank you to Jo and to Karen. So I think that worked out really, really well. And it's been a fantastic session. I think it's really, really great that the OT network and social work network are coming together. I know myself and Emma are really excited to take over the reins from Pete Budge. So a huge thank you to Pete Budge as well for all the hard work in raising the profile of the OT network. and we hope to continue with that good work. So I'm liking all these caps for the whole session. It's really fantastic. And just to reinforce what Sienna said, look after each other, look after yourselves, and keep on raising that profile of both social work and OT. We've got a fantastic and a really important part to play in social care. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.